Blood tastes like copper and betrayal when it hits frozen ground. Allara Veyne, beta of Iron Hollow Pack, an architect of an empire she'll never be allowed to rule, kneels in the dirt while the man she built a kingdom for calls her traitor. Kael Drathan stands above her like a golden god passing judgment, and beside him, draped in silver silk and wolf fur, stands the woman who will destroy them all. This is the story of what happens when loyalty becomes a death sentence and survival demands you burn down everything you once protected. Stay until the end to see how a discarded wolf becomes the thing kings fear most. Drop a like and comment your city below so I know my pack is watching. The first thing anyone needs to understand about power is this. Competence is the most dangerous trait a subordinate can possess. Allara learned that truth on her knees in the frozen mud of Iron Hollow's central square, surrounded by wolves who'd eaten from her hand for 12 straight years. Wolves whose children she'd kept alive through winters cruel enough to snap bone. Wolves who watched her bleed beneath torchlight and said nothing because silence is how cowards survive when kingdoms collapse. The Alpha stood above her, golden eyes reflecting firelight like coins at the bottom of a well. Kael Drathan, 6 feet 4 inches of inherited authority wrapped in ceremonial black and wolf fur, broad shoulders that had never carried anything heavier than expectation, jaw like carved stone, expression empty as a blade. He didn't shout. Didn't need to. Power speaks softest when it knows the room already belongs to it. Traitor, one word, delivered with the same tone a man might use to comment on weather. Beside him stood Lady Seraphine Vale, and that was when Allara understood she'd already lost. Seraphine wore silver silk that caught torchlight like scales, her dark hair braided with winter flowers that had no business blooming in February. Beautiful the way a blade is beautiful. Elegant the way poison is elegant. She smiled at Allara with teeth too white, too perfect. The smile of a woman who'd won before the game even started. Around them, the pack formed a semicircle in the snow. Faces Allara knew better than her own reflection. Marcus, who she'd taught to balance trade ledgers when his hands still shook from his father's beatings. Allara, whose first child Allara had delivered during a blizzard that killed 6 wolves in the southern territories. Old Thomas, who told her once that she had the best strategic mind he'd seen in 40 years of border wars. Every single one of them looked at the ground. That's what betrayal actually looks like. Not knives in the dark, not dramatic confrontations, just people you die for discovering it's easier to let you fall than to catch you. Kael's voice cut through the winter air like a judgment handed down from something holy. You've served Iron Hollow for 12 years, Allara Veyne. 12 years in which I welcomed you into my inner circle, trusted you with secrets, gave you authority that wolves spend lifetimes earning. He paused, letting the words settle like ash. And you repaid that trust with theft, sabotage, conspiracy against your own pack. Allara's ribs screamed where Kael's enforcers had kicked them an hour earlier. Blood ran slow and warm down her chin from where her lip had split against her teeth. Her wrists were bound behind her back with silver-threaded rope that burned like holy fire against shifter skin. But her voice came out steady. Which specific theft are we discussing, Alpha? Because last month I personally recovered 40,000 in stolen territory fees from the Redwood Pack. The month before, I identified the supply chain corruption that was bleeding us dry in the northern routes. Should I continue, or would you prefer to actually name what I supposedly stole? Kael's jaw tightened, just for a second. Just long enough for Allara to see the crack in the mask. He didn't know. Of course he didn't know. Kings rarely do. They just sign the execution orders and let other people fill in the details later. Seraphine stepped forward, her hand resting light as snowfall on Kael's arm. The gesture looked affectionate, supportive. Allara saw it for what it was, ownership. The evidence speaks clearly, Seraphine said, her voice soft and musical and absolutely lethal. Missing inventory, altered records, failed security patrols. Each incident traces directly back to your oversight, Beta Veyne. One might call it unfortunate coincidence, but this many failures suggest deliberate sabotage. She produced a leather folder from inside her silk coat, opened it with practiced elegance. These ledgers show systematic fund redirection over the past 6 months. Always small amounts, always carefully hidden, but the pattern is unmistakable. Allara stared at the documents and felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. The numbers were wrong, obviously wrong to anyone who actually understood Iron Hollow's financial architecture. But they were wrong in ways that would look convincing to people who didn't spend every waking hour keeping this kingdom alive. This wasn't about truth, this was about narrative, and Seraphine had written a story everyone wanted to believe. "Those records are falsified," Allara said flatly. "The timestamps don't match our audit schedule. The routing codes don't align with our banking protocols. Anyone with actual financial training would see that immediately." "Perhaps," Seraphine replied, smiling that perfect smile. "Or perhaps you're simply a skilled liar finally caught in her own web." The crowd murmured, low and uncertain, but the sound carried weight. That's the thing about accusations in public. Truth matters less than theater. Cale raised one hand and the murmuring stopped. He looked down at Allara with something that might have been regret if his pride allowed such vulnerable emotions. "I wanted to believe in you," he said quietly. "I truly did. But a leader cannot ignore evidence simply because it's inconvenient." And there it was, the core of everything. Cale wasn't stupid, wasn't incompetent. He was just terrified. Terrified that everyone could see what Allara had known for years, that she was the mind behind Iron Hollow's success, and he was just the face who stood in front and accepted credit. Every crisis she solved made him look smaller. Every disaster she prevented made his authority seem more decorative than functional. Every time the pack looked to her for answers, his crown felt less like power and more like costume jewelry. So he did what insecure rulers always do when confronted with competence they can't control. He called it treason and dressed up his fear in the language of justice. Allara met his eyes across the space between them. "You're making a mistake, Kyle." "The only mistake I made was trusting you." "No." Her voice hardened into something sharp enough to cut. "The mistake you're making is believing you can run this pack without me." Silence crashed down like a hammer, because that was the unspeakable truth everyone pretended not to know. Kyle inherited Iron Hollow from his father, who'd inherited it from his father, who'd built it through blood and brutality in a time when survival meant conquest. 3 generations of Drothans wearing the same crown, ruling the same territories. But the world had changed. Border wars weren't won with fangs and fury anymore. They were won with trade agreements and strategic alliances, with supply chains and economic leverage, with the kind of administrative genius that turned scattered wolf packs into a functioning empire. Allara had given Kyle that empire. She'd balanced the books, prevented the wars, negotiated the treaties that kept hostile packs from tearing Iron Hollow apart during the lean years when winter killed more wolves than violence ever could. She'd done all of it while Kyle played king in his father's shadow, learning to look authoritative without learning what authority actually required. And now he stood there, wrapped in ceremony and ancient bloodlines, preparing to throw away the only person who'd kept his kingdom from imploding. Kyle's expression went stone cold. "You will be stripped of your title effective immediately. Your access to pack resources is revoked. Your quarters will be searched and any stolen property returned." He paused, and for just a second, something almost human flickered across his face. "I'm granting you exile instead of execution. Consider it mercy for the service you once provided." Mercy. The word tasted like ashes in Allara's mouth. 12 years of holding his empire together. 12 years of sacrificing sleep and sanity to keep wolves alive. 12 years of watching Kyle take credit for her strategies while she smiled and pretended not to mind, and his mercy was letting her leave alive. Around them, the pack began to disperse, quickly, quietly. The way people always disappear when empires start devouring their own. Only a few wolves remained, Kyle's inner circle of sycophants and enforcers who'd learned that survival meant agreeing with whoever held the crown. And Seraphine. She watched Allara with dark eyes that held something worse than hatred. Satisfaction. 2 enforcers hauled Allara to her feet, their grips tight enough to bruise. Pain shot through her injured ribs like lightning. Kyle turned away without another word, his ceremonial coat billowing behind him like a king dismissing a servant. But Seraphine lingered. She stepped close enough that Allara could smell expensive perfume mixing with wood smoke and winter air. "You should have disappeared when you had the chance," Seraphine whispered. "A smart woman would have seen this coming and left before it became necessary to push her out." Alara's laugh came out sharp and broken. Is that what you think this is? Pushing me out? I think this is evolution, darling. The old making way for the new. The useful being replaced by the beautiful. You played your part. Kyle doesn't need an architect anymore. He needs someone who makes him feel like the king he's always pretended to be. And you're going to provide that? Seraphine's smile widened. I already have. Then she turned and followed Kyle into the darkness, silver silk trailing through snow like a wedding veil soaked in blood. Whoa. They threw Allara into her quarters under guard and told her she had until dawn to pack what she could carry. The space looked the same as always, small and practical. A bed she barely slept in, a desk buried under maps and ledgers, shelves filled with treaty documents and border agreements and trade route analyses that represented thousands of hours of work no one would ever see. 12 years of her life, reduced to a room barely larger than a cell. Allara sat on the edge of her bed and let herself feel it for exactly 60 seconds. The rage, the grief, the betrayal so complete it felt like her chest had been carved open and everything vital scraped out. 60 seconds. Then she stood up and started packing. Not clothes, not personal items, documents. Allara pulled specific ledgers from her shelves with the precision of a surgeon removing organs. Trade agreements Kyle didn't understand. Supply chain contacts he'd never bothered to memorize. Banking codes and territory treaties and alliance frameworks that existed only in her head and on these pages. The architecture of Iron Hollow's entire economic foundation, compiled into 3 leather satchels she could carry across her shoulders. Because if Kyle wanted to rule without her, he could discover exactly how much of his empire existed solely because she'd built it for him. A knock on the door made her freeze. It's me. Marcus. Allara opened the door to find her former assistant standing in the hallway, looking 15 years older than he had that morning. His face was gray, hands shaking. Don't, Allara said before he could speak. Don't apologize. Don't explain. I don't have the energy for guilt that comes too late to matter. He's making a mistake. I know. The pack won't survive without you. I know that too. Marcus stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Some of us, we're not okay with this. What they did to you. The lies Seraphine's been spreading. We see what's happening. But you won't stop it. He flinched like she'd slapped him. We have families, Allara, children. Kyle controls everything. If we speak up, we don't just lose our positions. We lose our homes, our safety, everything. And there it was. The equation that allowed tyranny to flourish. Good people calculating that their own survival mattered more than someone else's destruction. I'm not angry at you, Allara said, and meant it. I understand the math, but understanding doesn't change the outcome. You're going to watch Iron Hollow collapse, and you're going to tell yourselves you had no choice. What are you going to do? She looked at him for a long moment. Survive and remember. Marcus pulled a small leather pouch from his jacket and pressed it into her hands. Emergency funds. Not much, but enough to get you somewhere safe. There's also a list of contacts in the border territories. People who remember what you did for them. They'll help if you need it. Allara's throat tightened. Thank you. I'm sorry, he said again, and this time she let him say it. After he left, Allara finished packing in silence. The guards outside her door changed shifts twice before she was done. Neither pair spoke to her. Both looked uncomfortable, like men forced to guard the execution of someone they knew was innocent. At dawn, they escorted her to the northern gate. No ceremony, no final words from Kyle. Just 2 enforcers walking her to the border of Iron Hollow's territory and pointing toward the wilderness beyond. Don't come back, one of them said. Alpha's orders. You set foot on our land again. It's execution. Allara adjusted the satchels across her shoulders and looked back at Iron Hollow one last time. The compound spread across the valley below, hundreds of buildings connected by pathways she'd helped design. Smoke rose from chimneys into the gray winter sky. Wolves moved between structures on morning patrols, following routes she'd optimized for maximum coverage and minimum exposure. Her empire. Built with her hands, her mind, her blood. And now someone else's kingdom. She turned north and started walking. The wilderness between territories was where weak wolves died, and smart ones learned exactly what survival cost. Allara traveled for 3 days through snow deep enough to swallow her to the waist. Her ribs screamed with every breath. The silver rope burns on her wrists refused to heal properly, weeping clear fluid that froze in the cold air. She ate what she could scavenge, slept in rocky outcroppings that provided minimal shelter from wind that cut like knives. On the 4th day, she crossed into neutral territory and found a small trading post run by a grizzled wolf named Thomas Redclaw. He took one look at her and poured whiskey into a metal cup. "You're that beta from Iron Hollow, the one Kael Drathen threw out." Word traveled fast in the frontier. "I was." Heard different stories about why. Some say you stole from him. Others say his new woman wanted you gone. Which one's true? "Does it matter?" Thomas grunted. "Suppose not. Powerful men always find reasons to get rid of women who know too much. You planning to die out here, or you got somewhere to be?" Allara pulled out Marcus's list of contacts and slid it across the bar. "I need information. Which territories are stable? Which alphas are worth approaching? Who might be willing to take in a disgraced beta with strategic expertise and no loyalty to her former pack?" Thomas studied the list, then studied her. "Most alphas would see you as a liability. Kael's got influence across half the territories. Taking you in means making an enemy." "I know. But there's one alpha who might be interested." He tapped a name at the bottom of the list. "Ronan Vaylor, runs Moongrave Pack in the Eastern Highlands. He's been building something different out there. Not interested in the old power games. Word is he values competence over politics." "And you think he'd risk Kael's anger?" Thomas's smile showed teeth. "I think Ronan Vaylor doesn't give a damn about Kael Drathen's anger. That man fears nothing, respects strength, and hates bullies. You walk into Moongrave and prove you're worth the trouble, he'll back you against an army." Allara felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the desperate need to believe that somewhere in this brutal world, competence still mattered more than politics. "How do I get to Moongrave?" 3 weeks east through the Highland passes. Dangerous territory. Rogue packs. Hostile wildlife. People who'd kill you just for the supplies you're carrying. "I've survived worse." "Have you?" She met his eyes. "I survived 12 years of keeping Kael Drathen's empire from collapsing while he played king. I survived loving a man who valued his crown more than my life. I survived being thrown away like trash after giving everything. 3 weeks in the wilderness sounds like a vacation." Thomas poured her another whiskey. "Then I'd say Ronan Vaylor is about to meet the most dangerous kind of wolf." "What kind is that?" "The kind with nothing left to lose." Bamt. Allara reached the borders of Moongrave territory on a Tuesday morning when frost turned the world silver. The compound was smaller than Iron Hollow, but better fortified. Walls built from mountain stone instead of timber. Guard towers positioned with mathematical precision. Patrol patterns that suggested actual military training instead of traditional pack hierarchies. Someone who understood warfare ran this place. She was stopped at the main gate by 2 enforcers who looked like they could break oak trees with their bare hands. "State your business." "I'm here to speak with Alpha Vaylor. My name is Allara Veyne, former beta of Iron Hollow Pack. I'm offering my services in exchange for sanctuary." The guards exchanged glances. "Iron Hollow. You're the one Kael threw out." "I am." "Why should we let you pass these gates? For all we know, you're a spy." Allara reached slowly into her satchel and pulled out one of the ledgers. "Because in my hands, I'm carrying the complete economic architecture of Iron Hollow's trade network. Supply chains, banking protocols, alliance frameworks, and strategic weaknesses Kael doesn't even know exist. I can make Moongrave the most powerful pack on the frontier, or I can walk away and sell this information to your enemies. Your choice." The guard on the left looked uncertain. The guard on the right smiled. "Wait here." 20 minutes later, the gates opened. A man stepped through who made every wolf Allara had ever met look small by comparison. Not in size, though he stood tall enough. In presence. Ronan Vaylor moved like violence held perfectly in check. Dark hair pulled back from a face made of sharp angles and old scars. Eyes the color of storm clouds. Expression that revealed absolutely nothing. He studied Allara the way a general studies a battlefield. "You're bleeding." Allara glanced down at her side where her shirt had soaked through with blood from ribs that refused to heal. "Old injury." How old? 6 days. And you walked 3 weeks through hostile territory with broken ribs and infected wounds because you thought I might listen to your sales pitch? I walked 3 weeks through hostile territory because staying in Iron Hollow meant dying slowly under the rule of a king too insecure to let competent people survive near his throne. The sales pitch is just bonus content. Ronan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, of someone who understood exactly what empires cost. You were Kael Drathan's beta for 12 years. I was. Built most of his empire for him, from what I hear. You hear correctly. And he threw you out because his new woman wanted you gone. Among other reasons. Competence makes weak rulers nervous. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Walk with me." He led her through Moongrave's compound, pointing out structures and systems with minimal commentary. But Allara saw everything: the organization, the efficiency, the complete absence of the performative dominance games that ruled most packs. This wasn't a kingdom built on inherited authority. This was a machine designed by someone who understood that power without competence was just theater waiting to collapse. They ended up in Ronan's private study, a room lined with maps and military texts and strategic analyses that made Allara's professional soul ache with recognition. This man studied warfare the way she studied economics, as architecture, as mathematics, as something that could be mastered through discipline instead of just bloodline and bravado. Ronan poured 2 glasses of something amber and strong, handed one to Allara. "I'm going to be direct because I don't enjoy wasting time. You're dangerous, you're valuable, and you're carrying information that could devastate my oldest rival. That combination makes you either an incredible asset or a catastrophic liability. Which do you think I am? I think you're a woman with nothing to lose who just walked 3 weeks through hell to get here. That makes you both." Allara sipped the whiskey. It burned clean and honest. Nothing like the expensive poison Kael preferred. "What do you want to know? Why you're really here? Not the strategic pitch. The truth." She met his eyes and decided that lying would be pointless. This man would see through her the way she'd seen through Kael's weaknesses for years. "Because I spent 12 years building an empire for a man who loved his crown more than anything else. I believed that loyalty and competence would be enough. That if I just worked hard enough, made myself indispensable enough, I'd earn a place that couldn't be taken away." She paused, feeling the weight of every word. "I was wrong. And when I realized how wrong I was, I understood something terrible. The only way to survive in a world ruled by men like Kael is to become someone they fear more than they hate. Someone with power they can't touch. And you think I can give you that power?" "No," Allara said quietly. "I think I can build it myself. But I need someone strong enough to stand beside me while I do. Someone who won't panic when I succeed. Someone who values results over ego." Ronan leaned back in his chair. "You're asking for sanctuary, resources, and political backing in exchange for strategic expertise that might start a war." "Yes. Kael won't let this go. He'll see it as betrayal. He'll come for you eventually." "I know. And you're prepared for that?" Allara thought about kneeling in frozen mud while the man she'd loved called her traitor. About walking away from 12 years of her life with nothing but stolen documents and broken ribs. About the feeling of severing every connection to the only home she'd ever known because staying meant dying quietly in someone else's shadow. "I'm counting on it," she said. Ronan was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, walked to the window overlooking his territory. "I'll give you sanctuary, resources, a position in my inner circle. But understand something, Allara Veyne. I don't build kingdoms on loyalty alone. I build them on results. You fail me, and exile will be the kindest consequence you face." "Fair enough." He turned back to face her, and for the first time, something almost like respect crossed his features. "Then welcome to Moongrave. Let's burn Kael Drathan's empire to the ground and build something better from the ashes." Allara raised her glass. "I'll drink to that. Chum." Meanwhile, 200 miles west in Iron Hollow, Kael Drathan stood in his private study staring at reports that made his blood run cold. The supply chain was collapsing. Trade routes Allara had maintained were failing. Banking protocols she'd established were producing errors. Alliance frameworks that had seemed stable for years were suddenly fracturing. Marcus stood nearby, his face gray with exhaustion. We need to bring in external consultants, someone who understands the systems Allara built. Kael's hands clenched into fists. Absolutely not. That would be admitting we can't function without her. Find someone internal. Train them. Fix this quietly. My lord, we don't have time. The northern territories are already asking questions about missed shipments. If we don't stabilize things in the next 2 weeks, then stabilize them. Kael's voice cracked across the room like thunder. You were her assistant for years. Figure it out. Marcus looked at the floor. She never taught me everything. She said it was safer that way. That if knowledge was concentrated in one person, that person became irreplaceable. The irony hit Kael like a fist. Allara had made herself irreplaceable on purpose, built systems only she fully understood, created an empire that would crumble the moment she left. Not because she was power-hungry, but because she'd understood even back then that irreplaceable people were harder to throw away. Seraphine entered the study without knocking, elegant in midnight blue. Darling, you look terrible. Still dealing with Allara's mess? It's being handled. She crossed to him, ran her hands across his shoulders. Of course it is. You're the alpha. A few trade route problems are nothing you can't solve. But even as she said it, Kael saw something flicker in her expression. Satisfaction. Like she'd expected this. Planned for it. For the first time since he'd exiled Allara, doubt crept into Kael's mind like poison. What if he'd made a mistake? What if Seraphine had manipulated him into destroying the one person who'd kept his kingdom functional? What if Allara walking away meant the beginning of the end? He pushed the thoughts down brutally. No, he was the alpha, the son of conquerors. He didn't need some beta's administrative genius to rule. He'd prove it. He'd show everyone that Kael Drathan was more than just a crown and bloodline. But as he stood there, watching reports of his empire's slow collapse pile up on his desk, a terrible certainty settled in his chest. Allara Veyne was out there somewhere, alive, free. And when she came back, because women like that always came back, the reckoning would be absolute. 6 weeks after Allara Veyne walked through Moongrave's gates carrying Iron Hollow's secrets in leather satchels, the Eastern Territories started to notice something had shifted in the balance of power. Trade agreements that had taken decades to establish were suddenly being renegotiated with surgical precision. Supply routes that had hemorrhaged profit for years were restructured overnight. Border disputes that should have escalated into violence were being resolved through economic leverage so subtle that most alphas didn't realize they'd been outmaneuvered until the deals were already signed. Ronan Valor's name began appearing in conversations among territorial leaders with a new weight behind it. Not fear exactly, something worse, respect. And behind every strategic victory, invisible but undeniable, was the woman Kael Drathan had thrown away like garbage. Allara worked from a corner office in Moongrave's administrative building that overlooked the Eastern Highlands. The room was sparse, functional, a desk covered in maps and ledgers, walls lined with trade route analyses and economic projections, a single window that let in cold mountain light, no decorations, no personal items, nothing that suggested she planned to stay forever or leave tomorrow. Just the tools of someone rebuilding an empire one calculation at a time. Ronan entered without knocking, which was his way. He carried 2 metal cups of coffee that smelled like burned earth and efficiency. He set one on her desk and leaned against the wall, watching her work with the same intensity he brought to everything. Most alphas would have demanded eye contact. Ronan understood that competent people didn't stop working just because someone important walked into the room. That's why she'd started to trust him. After 5 minutes, Allara finished the projection she was building and looked up. The Redwood Pack is going to accept our terms. They'll sign by end of week. You're certain? Their supply chain is hemorrhaging cash in 3 different directions. I've made sure they understand that signing with us is the only way to stop the bleeding before winter. They'll complain, they'll posture, but they'll sign. Ronan's expression didn't change, but she caught the slight shift in his posture. Satisfaction. That makes 17 territories in 6 weeks. 18 if you count the informal agreement with Silverpine. They haven't signed yet, but their alpha sent me a private message asking about long-term partnership options. I'd call that a win. Kael's going to notice eventually. Kael already noticed. Allara pulled out a piece of correspondence and slid it across the desk. I've been getting reports from my old contacts in Iron Hollow. His supply chain is collapsing, trade routes failing, banking errors multiplying. Marcus is apparently working 20-hour days trying to hold things together. You feel bad about that? She considered the question honestly. I feel bad for Marcus. He's a good man caught in a bad situation. But Kael? She shook her head. Kael made his choice. He chose ego over survival. Now he gets to learn what that costs. Ronan picked up the correspondence, scanned it with the practiced efficiency of someone trained to extract information quickly. He sent 3 formal requests to the Northern Territories asking about your location. He's also quietly offered a substantial reward for anyone who can provide intelligence on your activities. Let me guess. He's calling it a security concern. He's calling you a dangerous fugitive who stole classified pack information. Allara laughed, sharp and humorless. I didn't steal anything. I built those systems. They only existed because I created them. Walking away with my own work isn't theft. It's severance pay. Kael doesn't see it that way. Kael doesn't see a lot of things. That's his fundamental problem. Ronan set the paper down and studied her with those storm-gray eyes that missed nothing. You're not scared of him coming after you. It wasn't a question. No, Allara said. I'm counting on it, because when he does, everyone will get to see exactly how much of Iron Hollow's success was his competence versus mine. That revelation alone will be worth whatever violence comes with it. And if he brings an army, then we'll deal with an army. You didn't bring me to Moongrave because you needed someone safe, Ronan. You brought me because you needed someone willing to burn the old world down and build something better from the ashes. He smiled, rare enough that it meant something. I'm starting to think I made a good investment. You made a dangerous one. There's a difference. Is there? The best investments usually are. He pushed off the wall, headed for the door, then paused. Council meeting tonight. I want you there. We're finalizing the Eastern Coalition framework, and some of the older alphas are still nervous about how fast we're moving. Your presence might help convince them we know what we're doing. Or it might convince them that Moongrave is being run by Kael Drathan's disgraced ex-beta and they should pull out while they still can. Let them try. I'd like to see which territories have the spine to walk away from guaranteed profit just because they're afraid of offending a king who's losing his grip on power. After he left, Allara returned to her projections, but her mind kept circling back to the same thought. Kael was going to come for her. Not today. Maybe not this month. But eventually, his pride would demand it. Men like Kael couldn't tolerate being outmaneuvered by women they'd discarded. It violated something fundamental in their understanding of how power worked. And when he came, she needed to be ready, not just strategically, emotionally, because there was a part of her that still remembered loving him, still remembered believing that loyalty and competence would be enough. Still remembered the exact tone of his voice when he'd called her traitor in front of everyone she'd spent 12 years protecting. That part of her wanted blood. The rest of her wanted something far more dangerous. She wanted to win so completely that Kael spent the rest of his life understanding exactly what he'd thrown away. Debts. The council meeting happened in Moongrave's main hall, a stone chamber built for function rather than ceremony. 20 territorial representatives sat around a massive oak table that had probably witnessed 1,000 negotiations before tonight. Allara took her seat at Ronan's right hand and felt the weight of every eye in the room. Most of the alphas present were older males who'd built their power during the blood-soaked years when strength meant survival. They looked at her the way ranchers might look at a wolf that wandered too close to the livestock. Dangerous. Unwelcome. Something to be dealt with before it caused problems. Alpha Garrett Stonewood from the northern reaches spoke first, his voice rough as gravel. With respect, Alpha Valor, some of us are concerned about the speed of these recent territorial agreements. 17 packs in 6 weeks seems aggressive, almost reckless. Ronan didn't blink. Aggressive would be conquering those territories through violence. What we're offering is economic partnership that benefits everyone involved. I'd call that the opposite of reckless. Perhaps. But there are questions about the source of this sudden strategic competence. Garrett's eyes shifted to Allara. We're all aware that you've recently acquired the services of Kael Drathan's former beta, a woman exiled under accusations of theft and sabotage. Allara met his gaze without flinching. Are you asking if the accusations were true, Alpha Stonewood, or are you asking if I'm competent enough to justify Ronan's faith in me? I'm asking if we should trust strategic advice from someone who betrayed her previous alpha. The room went silent. That was the thing about exile. It didn't matter if you were innocent. The stain of accusation followed you like blood and water. Allara leaned forward, her voice calm and surgical. I didn't betray Kael Drathan. I built his empire for 12 years while he learned to look authoritative in his father's crown. When his new woman decided I was inconvenient, he chose to believe fabricated evidence rather than admit he needed me. That's not betrayal. That's a weak king panicking when he realizes how fragile his power actually is. So you claim innocence. I claim competence, which Kael found more threatening than any actual crime I could have committed. And if you're concerned about my loyalty to Moongrave, consider this. I walked 3 weeks through hostile territory with broken ribs to get here, because I recognized Ronan as the only alpha on the frontier strong enough to build something that doesn't rely on inherited authority and performance theater. She pulled out a leather folder and opened it with precise movements. These are the economic projections for the next 18 months based on our current coalition framework. Every territory that's signed with us has seen an average profit increase of 32%. Border conflicts are down 60%. Resource allocation efficiency is up 47%. Those numbers don't lie, Alpha Stonewood. Kael's empire is collapsing because he lost the person who actually understood how modern territorial power works. Yours is about to flourish because Ronan was smart enough to value results over politics. She slid the projections across the table. So you can waste time questioning my past, or you can look at the data and decide if you want to be part of what we're building. Your choice. Garrett studied the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Ronan. She always this direct? Always. And you're comfortable with that? I prefer it. Politics is exhausting. I'd rather work with someone who tells me the truth than someone who tells me what I want to hear. Another alpha spoke up. Helena Ravencroft from the Southern Marshlands, a woman who'd held power for 3 decades through sheer ruthless competence. The Eastern Coalition is a solid framework, but what happens when Kael decides to respond? He's not going to tolerate this quietly. Men like him never do. Ronan's expression hardened into something that looked like controlled violence. Then Kael can bring whatever response he wants. Moongrave doesn't fold to threats. We're building something that works. If Iron Hollow wants to start a war over hurt pride, we'll finish it. With what army? Helena pressed. Kael has alliances across half the frontier. You're strong, Valor, but you're not invincible. Numbers don't win wars, Allara cut in. Strategy wins wars. Kael has quantity. We have precision. He rules through intimidation and tradition. We're building economic leverage that makes violence unnecessary. By the time he realizes he's been outmaneuvered, it'll be too late for military solutions. Helena studied Allara with sharp, calculating eyes. You really believe that? I spent 12 years watching Kael mistake ceremony for strength. I know exactly how hollow his power actually is. Strip away the theater and inherited authority, and you're left with a man who's never had to prove he deserves the crown he wears. And you want revenge for what he did to you. Allara didn't hesitate. I want him to understand what he lost. There's a difference. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Helena smiled, cold and approving. I like her. She's got the kind of anger that doesn't make you stupid. That's rare. The vote happened quickly after that. 17 territories confirmed their commitment to the coalition. 3 abstained, none opposed. As the representatives filed out, Helena paused beside Allara. Word of advice, girl. Men like Kael don't learn from being beaten. They learn from being humiliated. You want him to understand what he lost? Don't just outmaneuver him. Make sure everyone watches while you do it. That's the plan. Good. The frontier needs fewer kings and more people who actually know what the hell they're doing. After the hall emptied, Ronan and Allara stood alone among the shadows and torchlight. That went better than expected, Ronan said. You were expecting worse? I was expecting Garrett to walk out. The fact that he stayed means we're building something people actually want to be part of. That's leverage we didn't have 6 weeks ago. Allara gathered her documents, feeling the exhaustion that came after high-stakes negotiations. Kael's going to hear about this within days, maybe hours if he has anyone competent left in his intelligence network. Let him hear. Better he knows what's coming than we catch him by surprise. Surprised enemies make desperate decisions. And desperate kings start wars. Ronan's expression was unreadable. You think he'll actually move against us militarily? I think his pride won't let him do anything else. Every territory that signs with us is a public humiliation. Every success we achieve is a reminder that I was the architect of everything he claimed credit for. He can't tolerate that. Eventually, he'll convince himself that destroying Moongrave is the only way to restore his authority. Then we prepare for war. No, Allara said quietly. We prepare to win without fighting, because the worst thing you can do to a man like Kyle is prove he's irrelevant. 200 miles west in Iron Hollow, Kyle Drathan stood in his private chambers staring at reports that felt like nails being driven into his skull. Moongrave had signed 17 territories in 6 weeks. 17. The Eastern Coalition that was forming under Ronan Valor's leadership represented economic power that rivaled anything Iron Hollow had built in 3 generations. And behind every single victory was Allara's signature strategic precision. Marcus stood nearby, looking like he'd aged a decade in the past month and a half. The trade route to Silverpine collapsed this morning. They're claiming logistical issues, but intelligence suggests they're in private negotiations with Moongrave. If they sign, we lose access to the entire northern supply chain. Kale's hands clenched into fists. Allara. My lord? This is Allara. All of it. The precision, the timing, the way she's dismantling everything we built. Everything she built, Marcus corrected quietly. Then, seeing Kyle's expression, he added quickly, I'm just saying, most of our infrastructure was designed by her. She knows every weakness, every pressure point. She's using that knowledge to systematically destroy us. Then we adapt, redesign the systems, hire new strategists. With what money? Our profit margins have collapsed by 40%. The northern territories are withholding payment until we can guarantee supply chain stability. We're hemorrhaging resources faster than we can replace them. Seraphine entered the room wearing emerald silk and an expression of calculated concern. She crossed to Kyle, ran her fingers through his hair with practiced affection. Still obsessing over Allara? She's destroying everything I've built. She's building something new with Ronan Valor. There's a difference. Kale turned to face her, and for the first time since Seraphine had entered his life, he saw past the beauty and elegance to something colder underneath. You wanted this. Excuse me? You wanted Allara gone. Not because she was stealing, not because she was disloyal, but because she made you feel small, made you look like what you actually are, an accessory instead of a partner. Seraphine's smile didn't falter. Darling, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearly for the first time in months. You manipulated me into exiling the only person who knew how to run this pack. And now Iron Hollow is collapsing because I was stupid enough to believe your lies. Her expression went cold. I didn't lie about anything. Allara was exactly what I said she was, controlling, dangerous, a threat to your authority. The fact that she's now using her talents to destroy you just proves I was right. She's not trying to destroy me. She's trying to prove a point. What point? That she was the foundation, and I was just the king standing on top of it. That everything I thought was mine only existed because she created it. That exiling her meant exiling my own competence. Seraphine stepped back, her face transforming into something sharp and predatory. So what are you going to do? Beg her to come back? Admit publicly that you can't function without her? Destroy whatever authority you have left by proving every territory leader's suspicion that you're just a crown with nothing underneath? The words hit like physical blows. Because she was right. Admitting he needed Allara back meant admitting she'd been indispensable all along. Meant admitting he'd exiled her because his pride couldn't handle her competence. Meant admitting that Seraphine had played him perfectly and he'd been too arrogant to see it. His entire authority rested on the fiction that he was the source of Iron Hollow's power. Bringing Allara back destroyed that fiction forever. But watching his empire collapse destroyed it anyway. Just slower, more painfully. Kale turned away from both of them, staring out the window at Iron Hollow's compound spread across the valley below. His kingdom, built by his grandfather, maintained by his father, perfected by a woman he'd thrown away because she'd made him feel unnecessary. I want intelligence on Moongrave's defenses, he said, his voice cold and empty. Detailed reports, patrol patterns, supply vulnerabilities, everything. Marcus hesitated. My lord, are you considering military action? I'm considering my options. If Allara wants to dismantle Iron Hollow piece by piece, she can discover what happens when empires fight back. Ronan Valor isn't weak. His forces are disciplined, well-trained, and he's been building alliances specifically designed to counter traditional pack warfare. I don't care. Get me the intelligence. After Marcus left, Seraphine moved close again, her voice soft and poisonous. You're going to start a war over a woman who betrayed you. She didn't betray me. I betrayed her, and now she's making sure everyone knows it. So you prove her right by launching a doomed military campaign. That's your strategy? Kael looked at her, and something in his expression made her take a step back. My strategy is showing every territory on this frontier that betraying Iron Hollow has consequences. That nobody walks away from me and builds something better. That authority still matters even in this new world Allara thinks she's creating. You'll lose. Maybe. But I'll lose as a king fighting to protect his kingdom, not as a broken man watching his empire die quietly while everyone whispers about how much better things were when his beta ran everything. Seraphine was silent for a long moment. Then she smiled, slow and satisfied. Then I suppose we're going to war. Well, the message reached Allara 3 days later through one of her intelligence contacts in the Western Territories. Iron Hollow was mobilizing. Not obviously, not publicly, but supplies were being stockpiled. Border patrols were increasing. Diplomatic channels were being activated with Iron Hollow's oldest military allies. Kael was preparing for war. Allara read the report twice, then walked to Ronan's office and dropped it on his desk without preamble. He's coming. Ronan scanned the document with the same brutal efficiency he brought to everything. 2 months, maybe 3 before he's ready to move. Less if he's desperate, and Kael is definitely desperate. You think he'll actually attack Moongrave directly? I think he'll convince himself he has to, that destroying us is the only way to restore his authority, that showing strength through violence will make everyone forget how thoroughly we've outmaneuvered him economically. Ronan leaned back in his chair, thinking. We could negotiate, offer him face-saving terms, a formal alliance that lets him pretend he's still relevant. He won't accept. His pride can't tolerate sharing power with the woman he exiled. Then we fight. No. Alara's voice was hard. We win without fighting, because the moment Kael attacks us, every territory in our coalition sees him for what he actually is. A king so threatened by competence that he starts wars to protect his ego. That revelation destroys whatever political capital he has left. You want him to attack us? I want him to commit so completely to violence that everyone watches him prove he's exactly what I've been saying all along. A hollow crown protected by theater, an inherited authority. When he fails, the entire frontier understands that the old power structures don't work anymore. Ronan studied her with those storm-gray eyes. You're gambling with lives, with territory, with everything we've built. I'm gambling that Kael's pride is more powerful than his strategic judgment, and I've spent 12 years watching him make decisions. I know exactly how that math works. And if you're wrong, then we fight, and we win anyway, because we have something Kael never bothered to cultivate. What's that? People who follow us because they believe in what we're building, not because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. Ronan was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, walked to his weapons wall, and pulled down a ceremonial blade that looked old enough to predate the territorial system entirely. My grandfather told me something once. He said the difference between a king and a leader is simple. Kings demand loyalty through fear. Leaders earn it through respect. Kael's been playing king his entire life. You've been building something that actually works. When those two philosophies collide, only one survives. Which one? He smiled, cold and certain. The one willing to burn down the old world to prove the new one is better. Winter deepened across the frontier like a blade being slowly pressed against the throat of the world. Allara worked 20-hour days fortifying Moongrave's economic and military position. Every trade agreement was reviewed and reinforced. Every alliance was tested and strengthened. Every weakness in their defenses was identified and corrected. She built the coalition's strategic architecture the way she'd once built Iron Hollows, with precision, with ruthlessness. with the cold understanding that survival required being smarter than your enemies and more prepared than your circumstances demanded. But late at night, alone in her sparse quarters, she allowed herself to think about what was coming. Not the war itself. The moment when she'd have to face Kael across a battlefield and decide if destroying him completely was justice or just revenge dressed up in strategic clothing. There was a part of her that still remembered loving him, still remembered believing that if she just worked hard enough, proved herself indispensable enough, he'd see her value and treat her accordingly. That part of her had died in the frozen mud of Iron Hollow's square when he'd called her traitor in front of everyone she'd protected for 12 years. What remained was something colder, sharper. Something that understood the only way to survive in a world ruled by men who confused authority with competence was to become powerful enough that their opinions no longer mattered. She'd built Kael an empire. Now she was going to show him what happened when empires were built by people who actually knew what they were doing. A knock on her door pulled her from those thoughts. Ronan stood in the hallway, 2 glasses of whiskey in his hands. He entered without waiting for permission and handed her one. "You're thinking about him." It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about what happens when he finally commits to war, whether I'll feel victorious or just empty when it's over." "Both, probably. That's how revenge usually works." "This isn't revenge." "Isn't it?" Allara sipped the whiskey, feeling the burn. "Revenge is emotional. This is strategic. I'm dismantling his power base because it was built on lies and inherited authority. The fact that it hurts him personally is just a side effect." "You keep telling yourself that." "You think I'm lying?" "I think you're human. And humans have a hard time separating justice from vengeance when someone they love destroys them publicly." She looked at him for a long moment. "Did someone destroy you publicly?" "My father. He ruled Moongrave before me. Built his entire kingdom on fear and brutality and traditional pack hierarchies. When I suggested we could build something better, something based on discipline and strategy instead of bloodline and dominance, he called me weak, exiled me to the border territories to prove I couldn't survive without his protection." "But you did." "I thrived, built alliances, learned modern warfare, came back 10 years later with enough political leverage that he couldn't refuse me, took control of Moongrave and rebuilt it from the ground up." "What happened to him?" "He died bitter and alone, watching everything he'd built be systematically replaced by something that actually worked. I didn't kill him, didn't need to, just proved he was irrelevant and let time do the rest." Allara understood then why Ronan had given her sanctuary when every other alpha would have turned her away. He recognized her, not as a threat or an opportunity, as someone walking the same road he'd traveled years earlier. "You think that's what I'm doing to Kael? Proving he's irrelevant? I think you're doing something more dangerous. You're proving he was never relevant in the first place, that everything he thought was his only existed because you created it. That's not revenge, Allara. That's excavation. Digging down through layers of lies until you hit truth hard enough to break foundations. And when Kael's foundation breaks, then we'll be there to build something better from the rubble." He raised his glass. "To empires built by competent people instead of inherited crowns." Allara raised hers. "And to kings who learn too late that authority without competence is just theater waiting to collapse." They drank in silence while winter howled outside, and somewhere in the distance, Kael Drathin prepared for a war he'd already lost. He just didn't know it yet. Aprats. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when snow fell like ash, and the world smelled like iron and coming violence. Kael stood before his assembled war council, surrounded by territorial allies who'd agreed to support Iron Hollow's campaign against Moongrave. 12 packs, 4,000 wolves, the largest military coalition assembled on the frontier in 2 decades. He looked at the map spread across the table, showing Moongrave's territory marked in red, their coalition marked in gold, and all the spaces between filled with the strategic calculations that would decide who controlled the eastern territories for the next generation. Marcus stood to his right, looking exhausted and terrified. Seraphine stood to his left, looking satisfied in ways that made Kael's skin crawl. But he'd committed now, announced his intentions publicly, gathered his allies, made promises about restoring order and punishing betrayal. There was no walking back from this without looking weak, and weakness was the one thing kings couldn't survive. We move in 3 weeks, Kael announced, his voice carrying the weight of inherited authority and desperate certainty. Moongrave has been systematically destabilizing the frontier through economic manipulation and territorial interference. This ends now. One of the allied alphas, a scarred veteran named Crow, spoke up. Ronan Valor isn't weak. His forces are disciplined. This won't be a simple conquest. I'm not expecting simple, Kael replied. I'm expecting decisive. We hit them hard enough that every territory on the frontier understands what happens when people betray Iron Hollow's authority. And Allara Veyne? Crow asked. What happens to her when we take Moongrave? The room went silent. Everyone knew the real target of this war wasn't Ronan. It was the woman who'd built an empire, been thrown away, and then built something better just to prove she could. Kael's expression hardened into something that looked like royal certainty but felt like desperation underneath. Allara will be arrested and tried for theft of classified pack information. She'll be given the chance to confess publicly, apologize, and accept punishment. If she refuses, the consequences will be severe. You mean execution? I mean justice. But even as he said it, Kael knew the truth. This wasn't about justice. This was about a king so terrified of being forgotten that he'd start a war just to prove he still mattered. And somewhere in the Eastern Territories, in a sparse office overlooking mountains that looked like broken teeth against winter sky, Allara Veyne was waiting for him to make exactly this mistake. The kind of mistake that ended empires. The kind that proved once and for all who'd been holding the crown and who'd been carrying the kingdom all along. 3 weeks. Then the reckoning. The attack came 3 days early. Not because Kael changed his strategy, but because someone inside Moongrave's coalition sold them out for exactly the kind of money desperate people can't refuse. Allara was reviewing supply projections when the first alarm bells shattered the pre-dawn silence. She was on her feet before the second chime, grabbing her coat and weapons with the muscle memory of someone who'd survived 12 years in hostile political environments. The eastern watchtower was burning. She could see it from her window, flames licking up into the gray sky like a wound opening in the darkness. Smoke billowed black and thick, carrying the smell of burning wood and something worse underneath. Flesh. Ronan met her in the hallway, already armed, his face set in that expression of controlled violence that meant someone was about to learn what happened when you threatened Moongrave. They didn't speak. Didn't need to. This wasn't a raid. This was coordinated assault, which meant intelligence had been compromised, which meant someone they trusted had betrayed them. The command center was chaos. Wolves running in every direction, orders being shouted over the sound of distant combat, maps being updated in real time as reports flooded in from the border territories. Marcus Greystone stood at the center of it all, coordinating defensive positions with the kind of desperate efficiency that came from watching empires collapse. Marcus, from Iron Hollow, who'd arrived at Moongrave 2 weeks ago claiming he couldn't watch Kael destroy everything Allara had built. Who'd brought detailed intelligence about Iron Hollow's military capabilities and strategic weaknesses. Who'd integrated himself into Moongrave's defensive planning with the skillful precision of someone who knew exactly how crucial systems worked. Allara felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. She crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed Marcus by the collar, slamming him against the stone wall hard enough that his teeth clacked together. Her voice came out quiet. Lethal. How long? Marcus's eyes went wide with something that looked like genuine fear. Allara, How long have you been feeding Kael our intelligence? The room went silent. Every wolf in the command center stopped what they were doing and turned to watch, because betrayal was the kind of crime that demanded witnesses. Marcus's face crumbled. Not with guilt. With something worse. Relief. Like he'd been carrying this weight so long that being caught felt almost like mercy. 6 days, he whispered, since I arrived. He sent me here to gain your trust and report back. The attack was supposed to happen in 3 weeks, but Seraphine convinced him to move early. Catch you unprepared. She said you'd see it coming if you waited. Alara's grip tightened. You were my friend. I trusted you. I know. I protected you when Kael wanted to purge his inner circle. I taught you everything I knew. I made you indispensable. I know. Then why? Marcus met her eyes, and what she saw there was worse than hatred, exhaustion. Because Kael has my daughter, he said quietly. She's 8 years old. He told me if I didn't come here, if I didn't feed him intelligence, he'd make sure she disappeared. That I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if she was alive or dead, or suffering somewhere I couldn't reach her. The words hit like physical blows. That was the thing about power. It didn't just corrupt the people who wielded it. It turned good people into weapons by threatening the things they loved more than their own lives. Ronan stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Where are Kael's forces positioned? Marcus pulled a folded map from his jacket with shaking hands. Main assault from the northwest. Secondary forces hitting the eastern supply routes to cut off reinforcements. They're targeting the coalition leadership specifically. Kael wants to arrest Allara publicly, make an example of her in front of every territorial alpha on the frontier. And you were going to let him. I was going to save my daughter. There was nothing to say to that. No moral high ground to claim. Just the ugly math of survival in a world where kings held children hostage to control their parents. Allara released Marcus and stepped back. Lock him in the holding cells. We'll deal with his treason after we survive the next 6 hours. 2 guards moved forward to restrain him. Marcus didn't resist. Just looked at Allara with eyes that held 12 years of regret compressed into a single moment. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. She turned away without responding. Because sorry was just a word people used when they'd already made their choice and wanted to feel better about it afterward. Ronan was already reorganizing the defensive positions, his voice cutting through the chaos with brutal efficiency. Pull back from the eastern watchtower. It's already lost. Consolidate forces at the main compound. Get our coalition allies on emergency communication channels. I want every pack within 50 miles mobilized and moving our direction within the hour. It won't be enough, one of his lieutenants said. Kael brought 12 packs, 4,000 wolves. Even with coalition support, we're outnumbered 3-1. Then we make the numbers irrelevant. Allara, I need tactical options. Now. She moved to the primary map, her mind already calculating angles and leverage points with the same cold precision she'd brought to 12 years of keeping empires functional. The thing most people never understood about warfare was this. Battles weren't won by the side with the most soldiers. They were won by the side that controlled the narrative. Kael wanted a public execution, wanted to arrest her in front of witnesses and prove that betraying Iron Hollow carried consequences severe enough to terrify anyone else who might consider defecting. That need for theater was his weakness. Allara pulled out a piece of charcoal and started marking positions on the map. We don't fight them, she said. We let them take the compound. The room erupted in protests. Ronan raised one hand and the noise stopped. Explain. Kael needs me alive for his strategy to work. Public trial, public confession, public punishment. That's the entire point of this assault. So we give him what he wants. I surrender. Let him parade me in front of his allies. Let him think he's won. That's suicide. No. That's leverage. Because the moment Kael has me in custody, every territorial alpha on this frontier gets to watch him prove he's exactly what I've been saying all along. A king so threatened by competence that he starts wars to punish the woman who built his empire. That revelation destroys whatever political capital he has left. And if he decides execution is easier than a trial, then I die. But even my death serves a purpose. Martyrs are more dangerous than living rebels. Kael executing me without trial proves he's a tyrant. Every territory in our coalition sees it. Every neutral pack sees it. His authority collapses under the weight of his own brutality. Ronan studied her for a long moment. You're gambling with your life. I'm gambling that Kael's pride is more powerful than his strategic judgment. I've spent 12 years watching him choose theater over substance. He won't kill me quietly. He'll need the performance. And what do we do while you're being paraded around like a trophy? You fortify the coalition. Make it clear that Moongrave isn't just me, that the economic framework we've built doesn't collapse because one person gets captured. You prove to every territory on this frontier that what we're building is bigger than individual wolves. That's how you win wars that matter. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a blade drops. Then Ronan did something Allara hadn't expected. He smiled, cold and approving and absolutely lethal. You're either the smartest strategist I've ever met or the most self-destructive. I genuinely can't tell which. Why not both? He turned to his lieutenants. Execute her plan. Pull our forces back to secondary positions. Make it look like we're retreating in disarray. When Kael's forces breach the compound, offer minimal resistance. Let them think they've won quickly enough that they don't question it. One of the younger wolves stepped forward, his face pale. Alpha, with respect, this is insane. We're just handing them victory? We're handing them rope. Whether they hang themselves with it depends on how badly Kael needs to prove he's still relevant. The preparations took 2 hours. 2 hours of controlled chaos as Moongrave's forces evacuated to secondary positions while making it look like panicked retreat. 2 hours of destroying sensitive documents and securing supply lines and making sure that if the compound fell, nothing of strategic value fell with it. Allara spent those 2 hours writing letters, one to each of the coalition territories, one to Ronan, one to Marcus's daughter, because children deserve better than watching their parents destroy themselves to save them. She was sealing the last envelope when Ronan entered her quarters. He didn't say anything, just stood there looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that had seen too much violence to believe in easy victories. Finally, he spoke. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." "Why? Because you want revenge on Kael? Because you need to prove a point? Because someone needs to show the frontier that power built on fear and inherited authority doesn't work anymore. That competence matters more than bloodlines. That women who get thrown away for being too skilled can build something better than the kingdoms that tried to bury them." She stood, meeting his eyes. "And because if I don't do this, Kael wins by default. He gets to rewrite history. Gets to claim I was a traitor instead of the architect of his empire. Gets to spend the rest of his life believing he was justified in what he did to me. And you can't tolerate that." "No, I can't." Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled something from his coat. A blade. Old and brutal and marked with symbols that predated the territorial system by generations. "My grandfather's knife. He used it to carve out Moongrave from hostile territory when nobody believed a pack could survive in the Highlands. He told me once that the difference between surviving and thriving was simple. Survivors adapted to their circumstances. People who thrived forced their circumstances to adapt to them." He pressed the blade into her hands. "Come back alive. We're not done building yet. I'll try." "Don't try. Succeed. Because if you die, I'm going to be very annoyed that I invested all this time in someone who couldn't finish what she started." Despite everything, Allara smiled. "Wouldn't want to annoy you." "Damn right." The attack reached the compound's inner defenses just before dawn. Allara stood in the central courtyard, alone and unarmed, watching 4,000 wolves pour through broken gates like a flood that had finally found the crack in the dam. Kael's forces moved with the coordinated precision of people who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Squads breaking off to secure strategic positions, enforcers moving through buildings to clear resistance, scouts reporting back to command with mechanical efficiency. At the center of it all rode Kael Drathan. He looked different than Allara remembered. Thinner, harder. Like the weight of a collapsing empire had carved away everything soft until only the brutal architecture of authority remained. Beside him rode Seraphine, silver and beautiful and utterly satisfied. They stopped 20 feet from where Allara stood. Kael dismounted slowly, his golden eyes fixed on her with an expression that held too many emotions to name. Hatred, relief, vindication, loss. All of it compressed into the face of a king who'd just won a battle but knew the war was already lost. "Allara Veyne," his voice carried across the courtyard like a judgment. "You're under arrest for theft of classified pack information, conspiracy against Iron Hollow, and treason against your alpha." She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, letting him see exactly what he'd thrown away. The woman who'd built his empire and walked away with nothing but her dignity and the knowledge that she was worth more than any crown he could offer. Seraphine stepped forward, her smile sharp as broken glass. No witty response? No strategic maneuvering? How disappointing. Allara looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed. Not loudly, not hysterically, just once. A soft sound that cut through the dawn air like a blade finding the gap between ribs. "You think you've won," she said quietly. "Both of you. You think capturing me means victory, that parading me in front of your allies will restore the authority you've been hemorrhaging since the moment Kael exiled me." Kael's expression hardened. "You're a traitor. That's all you'll ever be. No, I'm the woman who built everything you claimed credit for. I'm the mind behind Iron Hollow's entire economic foundation. I'm the reason you were able to rule for 12 years without your empire collapsing under the weight of your incompetence. She took a step forward, and now I'm the mirror you can't bear to look at. Because every time you see me, you're forced to acknowledge the truth. That your crown was never protecting you. It was protecting you from realizing how empty you actually are. The courtyard went silent, because that was the thing about truth spoken in public. It didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be undeniable. Kael's face went white with rage. Take her. 4 enforcers moved forward and grabbed Allara's arms. She didn't resist, didn't fight, just met Kael's eyes as they bound her wrists with silver-threaded rope that burned like holy fire. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. The only mistake I made was trusting you in the first place. No. The mistake you're making is believing this ends with my capture. That arresting me proves you were right and I was wrong. That public punishment will restore the authority you've lost. Then what does it prove? It proves you're exactly what I always knew you were. A frightened king clinging to power he never earned, destroying anyone strong enough to remind him of that fact. Seraphine stepped close, her voice soft and poisonous. You lost, darling. Accept it gracefully. Allara looked at her and saw something she'd missed before. Fear. Not of Allara, of Kael, because Seraphine had built her entire strategy on being the woman who replaced Allara, the beautiful prize Kael claimed after discarding the competent one. But prizes only held value as long as kings believed they were worth more than what they'd sacrificed to obtain them. And right now, staring at the woman who'd built his empire kneeling in silver rope, Kael was starting to calculate the cost. They dragged Allara to a cage wagon. Iron bars and silver reinforcements designed to hold the most dangerous criminals on the frontier. As they locked her inside, she caught sight of someone in the crowd. Marcus. Free. Unbound. Standing beside Kael like he'd never been imprisoned at all. Their eyes met across the distance. And in that moment, Allara understood the full scope of the betrayal. Marcus hadn't just fed Kael intelligence about Moongrave's defenses. He'd helped plan this entire assault, had been working with Seraphine for months, maybe longer, had used his daughter as an excuse because it was easier than admitting he'd chosen the winning side when Iron Hollow started collapsing. The rage that filled Allara's chest was so complete, it felt like her ribs might crack from the pressure. But she pushed it down, buried it deep beneath layers of strategic calculation and cold certainty. Because rage was useless unless it could be weaponized. And she was going to weaponize every single emotion Kael had forced her to feel since the moment he'd called her traitor. The convoy started moving, 4,000 wolves escorting one prisoner back to Iron Hollow for trial and punishment. Seraphine rode beside Kael's horse, her hand resting possessively on his arm. She leaned close and whispered something that made him smile, the first genuine smile Allara had seen on his face in years. That's when she knew. This wasn't about justice or territory, or even revenge. This was about Seraphine proving she could replace Allara completely, could give Kael everything the competent woman had provided, plus the validation his wounded pride craved, could be the Empire's new architect, while also being the beautiful prize that made Kael feel like the king he'd always pretended to be. It was almost brilliant. Almost. Because Seraphine had made the same mistake Kael had made when he'd exiled Allara. She'd confused theater with substance, believed that looking like power was the same as actually possessing it, and that mistake was going to cost them everything. The journey to Iron Hollow took 4 days. 4 days locked in a cage wagon that smelled like rust and old blood, and the failures of everyone who'd been transported in it before her. 4 days of watching Kael and Seraphine play the roles of triumphant king and adoring queen, while the empire they thought they'd secured continued collapsing around them. 4 days of planning exactly how to turn their victory into the most catastrophic defeat they'd ever experienced. On the morning of the 5th day, they reached Iron Hollow's borders. The compound looked smaller than Allara remembered, shabbier. Like 12 years of her maintenance had been holding together structural decay that was only now becoming visible. Wolves lined the streets to watch her arrival, faces she recognized, people she'd protected and fed and kept alive through winters cruel enough to break weaker packs. They watched her pass in silence, no cheers, no jeers, just the heavy quiet of people who knew something terrible was happening but felt powerless to stop it. The cage wagon stopped in the central square, the same square where Kael had called her traitor 6 months ago, the same frozen ground where she'd tasted blood and dirt and betrayal. Only this time, the square was packed with territorial alphas and coalition representatives and neutral observers who'd come to watch Kael Drathan prove he still controlled the frontier. Hundreds of witnesses. Exactly what Allara needed. They dragged her from the cage and forced her to her knees in the center of the square. Kael stood above her on a raised platform, dressed in ceremonial black that made him look like a judge presiding over execution. His voice carried across the silent crowd. Allara Veyne, you stand accused of theft, sabotage, and conspiracy against Iron Hollow Pack. You systematically undermined your alpha's authority, stole classified intelligence, and used that information to build a rival power base designed to destroy everything you once claimed to protect. He paused, letting the accusations settle. How do you answer these charges? Allara looked up at him, at the man she'd loved and served and built an empire for, at the frightened king wearing a crown 3 sizes too large for his actual competence. And she smiled, not with malice, not with triumph, with pity. I answer that you're a coward, she said clearly. A frightened little boy who inherited power he never earned and spent 12 years terrified that everyone would notice. I built your empire while you played king. I prevented the wars. I negotiated the treaties. I created the economic systems that kept this pack functional while you took credit and convinced yourself you were indispensable. The crowd murmured, low and uncertain. Kael's face went white. You admit your treason. I admit my competence, which you found more threatening than any actual crime. So you let your new woman manipulate you into exiling me because keeping me around meant acknowledging that your authority was decorative, that the real power was in the systems I created, not the crown you inherited. Lies. Seraphine's voice cut across the square like a whip. You stole from us, undermined us, built your coalition using intelligence that rightfully belonged to Iron Hollow. Allara turned her attention to Seraphine. I built those systems, created that intelligence, spent 12 years architecting an empire that only functioned because I made it functional. Walking away with my own work isn't theft. It's severance pay for services rendered to a king too insecure to value them. She looked back at Kael. And you know I'm right. That's why you needed this performance. Why you brought an army to capture one woman. Why you're holding this trial in front of witnesses. Because deep down, you understand that without me, Iron Hollow falls apart. And proving I'm a traitor is the only way you can justify what you did without admitting you destroyed your own empire because your pride couldn't handle being saved by someone smarter than you. The silence that followed was absolute, because everyone in that square knew she was right, had watched Iron Hollow collapse over the past 6 months, had seen trade routes fail and alliances fracture and economic systems break down, had whispered among themselves about how much better things were when Kael's Beta ran everything. And now that Beta was kneeling in silver rope, speaking truth to power in front of every territorial leader who mattered. Kael's hands clenched into fists. You will confess your crimes. You will apologize publicly. You will accept punishment for your treason. Or what? You'll kill me? Execute me without trial and prove to everyone here that you're a tyrant who murders competent women for threatening your ego? She stood slowly, despite the guards trying to force her back down. Go ahead, Kael. Give the order. Let every alpha in this square watch you prove you're exactly what I've been saying all along. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Seraphine leaned close to Kael and whispered something urgent. His expression shifted from rage to something colder. Calculation. And Allara realized too late that she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd assumed Kael needed her alive for his strategy to work, had gambled everything on his pride demanding a public confession before punishment. But Seraphine had just reminded him of something crucial. Dead martyrs were dangerous. But martyrs who confessed before execution became cautionary tales instead of rallying symbols. Kael's voice came out quiet and absolutely certain. You'll confess, or I'll start executing your coalition allies one by one until you do. Helena Ravencroft first, then Thomas Redclaw, then every single wolf who followed you into betrayal. I'll turn your coalition into a graveyard and make sure everyone knows it happened because you were too proud to admit you were wrong. Allara's blood went cold. Because that was the thing about kings backed into corners. They stopped caring about optics and started caring only about winning, and Kael had finally realized that destroying her wasn't enough. He needed to destroy everything she'd built, everyone she'd protected, every territory that had dared to believe competence mattered more than inherited authority. That was the price of losing to someone you'd once thrown away. Complete annihilation. So thorough that nobody would ever dare follow her example again. Seraphine stepped forward, her smile triumphant. Choose, darling. Your pride or their lives, though I suppose we both know you've always been better at strategy than caring about actual people. And in that moment, kneeling in frozen ground while 4,000 wolves watched and Kael prepared to execute her coalition unless she surrendered everything, Allara understood something terrible. She'd been so focused on outmaneuvering Kael that she'd forgotten the fundamental rule of frontier politics. Kings didn't need to win fair. They just needed to win. And Kael had finally learned to stop fighting her on her terms and start fighting on his. The kind of fight where innocence died until the guilty surrendered. The kind where competence didn't matter. Only brutality. She looked at Kael across the distance between them and saw exactly what he'd become. Not a king. A man so desperate to prove he mattered that he'd burn the entire frontier just to avoid admitting he'd been wrong. And the worst part was knowing she'd helped create him. Had spent 12 years protecting him from the consequences of his incompetence. Had built him an empire so strong he'd never needed to learn how actual power worked. Had loved him enough to make him believe he deserved a crown he'd never earned. This was her fault. Not for leaving, for staying too long. Allara closed her eyes and felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Then she opened them and looked directly at Kael, and said the only thing that could possibly save the coalition she'd built from the ruins of his empire, the one thing she'd sworn she'd never say. I confess. The words hung in the frozen air like smoke from a funeral pyre. I confess. Allara watched those two words land on Kael's face and saw something flicker across his expression that looked almost like disappointment. Like he'd wanted her to fight, to resist, to prove that breaking her required more than just threatening the people she'd protected. But that was the difference between kings and leaders. Kings believed power meant making people submit. Leaders understood that real strength was knowing when to surrender a battle to win a war. Seraphine's smile widened, sharp and satisfied. Say it properly. Say the words everyone needs to hear. Allara met Kael's eyes across the distance between them and spoke with the kind of clarity that came from knowing exactly what she was doing. I confess to building Iron Hollow's economic infrastructure and walking away with knowledge of systems I created. I confess to using that knowledge to establish a coalition designed to prove competence matters more than inherited authority. I confess to every strategic decision that made Kael Drathen look small by comparison. She paused, letting the words settle. But I don't confess to theft, or sabotage, or treason. Because you can't steal what you built. You can't sabotage an empire that only functioned because you held it together. And you can't betray a king who valued his crown more than the woman who made that crown mean something. The crowd murmured, low and dangerous. Because that wasn't the confession Kael had demanded. That was truth dressed up in the language of admission, a confession that acknowledged actions while refusing to accept the labels attached to them. Kael's face went white with rage. That's not good enough. It's all you're getting. You wanted me to confess publicly. I have. Now release my coalition allies and let them return to their territories, or prove to everyone here that this was never about justice. Just a frightened king trying to destroy everyone who reminds him how hollow his authority actually is. Seraphine stepped forward, her voice cutting across the square like winter wind. You think you're clever. Think you can manipulate the narrative even while kneeling in silver rope. But you've already lost, Allara. Your coalition will fracture the moment you're executed. Your territories will scramble to make peace with Iron Hollow. Everything you built will collapse because it was built on the foundation of one woman's competence. And competent women died just as easily as incompetent ones. Allara looked at her and saw past the beauty and elegance to something desperate underneath. Fear. Because Seraphine had gambled everything on replacing Allara completely. On being the woman who could give Kael both competence and validation. But standing here watching the crowd's reaction to Allara's confession, she was starting to realize something terrible. You couldn't replace someone by destroying them. You could only prove how irreplaceable they'd been all along. Allara's voice came out quiet, but absolutely certain. My coalition won't fracture, because I didn't build it on my competence alone. I built it on a framework that functions whether I'm alive or dead, economic systems that don't require one person to maintain, alliance structures designed to survive leadership transitions. That's the difference between what I created and what Kael inherited. His empire needs him. Mine doesn't need me. She looked directly at Kael. So go ahead, execute me. Prove to everyone here that Iron Hollow's idea of justice is killing the woman who built your empire because she had the audacity to walk away when you threw her out. Let every territorial alpha in this square watch you become exactly what the frontier fears most. A tyrant clinging to power through violence because he lost the ability to inspire loyalty. For a long moment, Kael said nothing. Just stood there on his platform, surrounded by 4,000 wolves and dozens of territorial witnesses, realizing that every choice available to him was wrong. Execute Allara, and he proved her point about being a tyrant. Release her, and he admitted the trial was performance theater. Keep her imprisoned indefinitely, and he looked weak. There was no winning move, because Allara had built a strategic trap so perfect that the only way out was admitting he'd been wrong from the beginning. And kings didn't admit being wrong. Not publicly. Not in front of witnesses who'd use that weakness to undermine everything they'd built. That was the fundamental curse of inherited authority. It demanded infallibility, and infallibility meant never backing down even when backing down was the only rational choice. Kael's voice came out cold and final. You'll be held in custody until formal sentencing. Your coalition allies are released but barred from leaving Iron Hollow territory until we've verified they had no part in your conspiracy. It wasn't execution, but it wasn't mercy either. Just a king buying time to figure out how to destroy her without destroying himself in the process. They dragged Allara to the holding cells beneath Iron Hollow's command center. Stone walls that wept moisture. Iron bars reinforced with silver. A space designed to break people slowly through isolation and cold and the grinding certainty that nobody was coming to save them. She'd been here before, 12 years ago, when a rival Alpha's son had tried to assassinate Kael, and she'd tracked the conspiracy back to its source. Had spent 3 days interrogating the conspirators in these same cells until they'd given up every name and contact. The irony wasn't lost on her. The cells she'd once used to protect Kael's empire were now the cells holding her for the crime of leaving it. The guards locked her in and left without speaking. Allara sat on the stone bench that served as furniture and let herself feel it for exactly 60 seconds. The exhaustion, the fear, the crushing weight of knowing she'd just confessed to crimes she didn't commit to save people who might not even survive the next week. 60 seconds. Then she stood up and started analyzing her options. The cell was secure but not perfect. The lock was standard Iron Hollow design. The guards rotated every 6 hours. The stone walls were thick, but the ventilation shafts connected to the main compound's air system. She'd designed this entire detention facility 12 years ago. Knew every weakness, every oversight, every place where security theater replaced actual security because the budget had been tight and Kael had insisted on spending money on ceremonial bullshit instead of functional infrastructure. Escaping would be difficult, but not impossible. The question was whether escaping served her strategy better than staying. Because Seraphine had made a mistake in that square, had revealed that Iron Hollow's plan wasn't just holding Allara until formal sentencing, it was keeping her coalition allies trapped in Iron Hollow territory until they could be systematically destroyed. That meant Ronan was here somewhere, along with Helena Ravencroft and Thomas Redclaw and every other territorial alpha who'd signed with Moongrave's coalition. All of them trapped behind Iron Hollow's borders while Kael and Seraphine figured out how to eliminate them without starting a war that would consume the entire frontier. Allara closed her eyes and thought through the variables. Kael needed her alive for now, because executing her immediately would confirm everything she'd said about tyranny and violence. But he also needed her coalition destroyed because letting them leave meant admitting he couldn't control the territories anymore. Seraphine needed Allara dead, because alive she represented everything Seraphine could never replace. But she also needed the death to look justified because unjustified execution would turn the frontier against Iron Hollow permanently. Both of them were trapped in the same strategic cage Allara had built, needing her dead but unable to kill her, needing her silenced but unable to silence her without proving her right. That paradox was the weapon, the thing that would either save her or destroy everyone she'd tried to protect. Hours passed. The cell grew colder as night settled over Iron Hollow like a blanket soaked in ice water. Allara paced, measuring distances, cataloging every detail of her environment with the mechanical precision of someone who'd survived 12 years in hostile territory by noticing things other people missed. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Not guards. Wrong rhythm. Wrong weight. The door opened. Ronan Valor stood in the entrance, flanked by two of Iron Hollow's enforcers, who looked distinctly uncomfortable about escorting a foreign alpha into the detention cells. His storm gray eyes scanned the cell, then landed on Allara. "You look terrible. I've had better weeks." The guard stepped back but didn't leave. Protocol demanded they stay within sight of any prisoner meeting with visitors. Ronan entered the cell and sat on the stone bench like he was settling in for casual conversation instead of visiting someone facing execution. Kael's offering terms. Alara's laugh came out sharp. "Let me guess. Public apology. Permanent exile. Agreement to dismantle the coalition and never set foot on frontier territory again. Close. Public apology. Supervised exile. An agreement to provide Iron Hollow with complete intelligence on Moongrave's economic systems in exchange for your coalition allies being released unharmed. So he wants me to give him the framework I built so he can claim he forced me to surrender it. Make himself look strong while stealing the only leverage I have left. Essentially. What did you tell him? That I'd present his offer and let you decide, but that if you accepted, the coalition would honor whatever terms you negotiated because we don't abandon people who built something worth protecting." Allara studied him carefully. "You're giving me permission to surrender. I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your choice." She stood and walked to the bars, her voice dropping low enough that the guards couldn't hear. "What's really happening out there?" Kael's holding 73 coalition representatives under house arrest. Helena, Thomas, and 16 other territorial alphas are being detained in the guest quarters under guard. Seraphine's been meeting privately with neutral pack leaders, building support for formal charges against everyone who signed with Moongrave. She's calling it conspiracy to destabilize frontier governance. And if those charges go through, mass executions, public trials, complete destruction of everything we built. She'll turn the coalition into a cautionary tale about what happens when people challenge traditional authority. Allara felt something cold settle in her chest, because that was the endgame. Not just destroying her, destroying the idea that competence could challenge inherited power, making sure nobody ever dared to build what she'd built again. How long do we have? Formal charges are being drafted now. Kael's planning to present them to the Frontier Council in 3 days. Once they're official, he can execute coalition leadership without it being considered murder, just enforcement of frontier law. 3 days. To escape. To fight. To somehow dismantle the trap that was closing around everyone she'd tried to protect. Ronan's voice dropped even lower. "There's a supply convoy leaving for the Eastern Territories tomorrow at dawn. Lightly guarded. If someone were to create a distraction during the night shift change, certain prisoners might be able to reach that convoy before anyone noticed they were missing." "You're telling me how to escape." "I'm telling you that cages only hold people who believe they should stay in them. What you do with that information is between you and whatever survival instinct kept you alive through 12 years of Kael's incompetence. Why are you helping me? If I escape, Kael will assume you aided me. You'll be executed alongside everyone else." Ronan smiled, cold and certain. "Because I didn't bring you to Moongrave to watch you rot in Kael Drathan's prison. I brought you because you're the most dangerous kind of person in the world, someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. That combination doesn't die quietly in cells. It burns down empires and builds new ones from the ashes." He stood and walked to the door, then paused. "My grandfather told me something once. He said the frontier doesn't belong to the strongest wolves or the oldest bloodlines. It belongs to whoever's willing to fight for it when everyone else accepts defeat." "Allara Veyne, you're the most stubborn person I've ever met. Don't waste that by accepting a cage someone else built for you." Then he was gone, leaving Allara alone with exactly the information she needed and the most dangerous choice she'd faced since walking away from Iron Hollow 6 months ago. Stay and accept whatever mercy Kael might offer, or escape and start a war that would consume the entire frontier. Neither option was good, but one option was hers. and that made all the difference. She waited until the guard shift changed at midnight. Waited until the new guards settled into their positions with the tired carelessness of people who'd done this rotation 1,000 times. Waited until the compound quieted to that particular silence that came when most wolves were asleep, and the ones still awake were too exhausted to be properly vigilant. Then she pulled Ronan's grandfather's blade from where she'd hidden it in her boot during the chaos of being arrested. The lock on her cell was standard iron hollow design. She'd helped specify those locks 12 years ago when they'd been updating the detention facility. Knew exactly where the pins would catch, exactly how much pressure to apply. The lock clicked open after 90 seconds. Allara slipped into the corridor, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years navigating hostile territory without being noticed. The compound was massive, but she knew every corridor, every checkpoint, every patrol route, had walked these halls so many times she could navigate them blind. The detention center connected to the main compound through a service tunnel that ran beneath the eastern wing, maintenance access, designed for plumbing emergencies and electrical repairs. Allara had used it dozens of times to move quickly between buildings without being seen. She reached the tunnel entrance and found it locked. Different lock. Newer design. Something installed after she'd left. She pulled out Ronan's blade and started working on the mechanism, feeling the pins resist, then give way one by one. A voice behind her made her freeze. "You were always better at locks than combat." Allara turned slowly. Marcus stood in the shadows, unarmed but blocking her only exit. His face looked gray in the dim light. Exhausted. Haunted by choices that couldn't be undone. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Marcus spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "My daughter's being held in the western compound. 3rd floor. Room 17. Seraphine arranged it. Said if I helped with your arrest, she'd make sure my girl was treated well, fed properly, given warm clothes." "And you believed her?" "I believed I didn't have a choice. Everyone has choices. You just chose the one that let you sleep at night." Marcus's expression crumbled. "She's 8 years old, Allara. She cries for her mother who died 3 years ago. She has nightmares about being abandoned. I couldn't let Kyle take her from me. I couldn't survive that. So instead you helped him destroy the coalition, helped him arrest people who trusted you, helped him build a trap designed to execute everyone who dared to believe competence mattered more than bloodlines." "I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't resurrect the dead. Sorry doesn't undo betrayal. Sorry is just noise people make when they want forgiveness for choices they'd make again under the same circumstances." She stepped toward him. "Are you going to stop me?" Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. The eastern convoy leaves at dawn from the supply depot. There's a gap in the patrol route between the detention center and the depot at 0400. 7 minutes. That's your window. "Why are you helping me?" "Because Kyl's going to execute the coalition leadership regardless of what you do. And when that happens, he'll decide my daughter is a liability instead of leverage. The only way she survives is if someone stops him before the formal charges go through. You want me to save your daughter. I want you to burn this entire kingdom to the ground and build something better from the ashes. Something where children aren't used as weapons against their parents." Allara studied him carefully. "If I survive this, I'm coming back for everyone Kyl's holding hostage, including your daughter, but not because you helped me, because she deserves better than being a pawn in someone else's power games." Marcus's eyes filled with something that looked like hope. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Just get out of my way and pray I'm as dangerous as everyone seems to think I am." She slipped past him into the service tunnel, moving fast now because the window Marcus had described was closing with every second. The tunnel was dark and narrow and smelled like rust and old water damage. Allara navigated by memory, counting steps, feeling for landmarks she'd memorized years ago. She emerged in the supply depot's loading area 40 seconds before the patrol sweep. The eastern convoy was being loaded with medical supplies and food shipments for border territories. 3 wagons. Minimal guards because nobody expected trouble on a routine supply run. Allara climbed into the rear wagon and buried herself under canvas tarps that smelled like grain and preservatives. Then she waited, fighting the urge to move, to run, to do anything except trust that her timing had been perfect and Marcus's intelligence was accurate. Footsteps approached. Guards doing final checks before departure. They circled the wagons twice, checking cargo manifests and security protocols. Never looked under the tarps. The convoy started moving just as gray dawn light began bleeding across the eastern horizon. Allara lay perfectly still as the wagons rolled through Iron Hollow's gates and out into the wilderness beyond. Every meter they traveled felt like victory and disaster compressed into the same moment. Because she'd escaped. But escaping meant Kyle would assume Ronan had helped her, would use that assumption to justify arresting Moongrave's leadership, would accelerate the formal charges and executions. She'd bought herself freedom at the cost of making everything worse for everyone she'd tried to protect. That was the curse of survival in a world ruled by tyrants. Sometimes staying alive meant watching other people die in your place. The convoy traveled for 6 hours before stopping at a neutral way station to change horses and resupply. Allara waited until the guards were distracted, then slipped out of the wagon and into the surrounding forest. She ran, through pine forests that smelled like winter and old violence, across frozen streams that tried to steal the feeling from her feet, between territories that would execute her on sight if they recognized her. She ran until her lungs burned and her ribs screamed and every muscle in her body begged for rest. Then she ran further, because the frontier didn't care about exhaustion or pain or the crushing weight of knowing you just started a war you might not be strong enough to win. It only cared about who was still standing when the violence finally stopped. 3 days later, Allara reached Moongrave's borders. The sentries recognized her immediately and sent runners to alert Ronan. He met her at the main gates, flanked by his lieutenants, and looking like he hadn't slept since she'd been captured. When he saw her, something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly. Acknowledgement that the war they'd both known was coming had finally begun. You escaped. I escaped. And Kyle's going to use that as justification to execute every coalition leader he's holding. We have maybe 48 hours before the formal charges go through and he starts the executions. Then we go to war. Not yet. War is what Kyle wants. What Seraphine's been engineering from the beginning. She wants us to attack Iron Hollow so she can justify destroying the coalition as hostile insurgents instead of legitimate political opposition. Then what's your plan? Allara looked at him with eyes that had seen too much and survived too long to believe in easy victories. We expose her, show every territorial alpha on this frontier exactly who's been orchestrating this conflict. Prove that Seraphine's been manipulating Kyle into starting a war designed to consolidate her own power, that she's been using him the same way he used me. As a tool to build an empire she'll control from the shadows. You have evidence? I have 12 years of understanding how Iron Hollow's intelligence network operates. I know where they keep sensitive communications. I know which systems have vulnerabilities. I know exactly how to get the proof we need. And getting that proof requires what exactly? Breaking back into Iron Hollow's command center, accessing their secure archives, extracting documentation of every conversation Seraphine's had with neutral pack leaders about destroying the coalition, then broadcasting that evidence to every territorial alpha simultaneously before Kyle can suppress it. Ronan stared at her like she'd just proposed flying to the moon. That's suicide. Probably. But it's the only move that saves the coalition without starting a war that kills thousands. Seraphine's entire strategy relies on staying invisible, on being the beautiful woman standing beside Kyle while he makes every decision. The moment we prove she's been the architect all along, her power collapses. And without her manipulation, Kyle loses the justification for executing coalition leadership. And if you're caught, then I die. But I die proving that everything I've been saying is true. That Iron Hollow's authority is hollow. That the old power structures don't work. That competence and strategy matter more than crowns and inherited bloodlines. She stepped closer. Ronan, I've spent 6 months building something worth protecting, a coalition based on shared prosperity instead of fear. Economic systems that function without requiring one person to maintain them. The possibility that the frontier can evolve past endless violence and domination games. I'm not letting Seraphine destroy that because Kyle's too proud to admit he was wrong. You really think you can pull this off? I think I'm the only person alive who knows Iron Hollow's systems well enough to have a chance. And I think doing nothing means watching everyone I've tried to protect get executed while the frontier slides back into the same brutal power structures that have kept us trapped for generations. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, cold and approving and absolutely feral. When do we leave? We don't. I go alone. You stay here and prepare for war in case I fail. Make sure the coalition survives whether I come back or not. Like hell. You're not walking into Iron Hollow alone. I am. Because if you come with me and we both get caught, the coalition loses its leadership and Kael wins by default. But if I go alone and fail, you're still here to lead the resistance, to make sure what we built doesn't die just because I did. That's not a plan. That's martyrdom. Sometimes they're the same thing. She turned toward the compound, her voice carrying certainty that came from knowing exactly what she had to do. Gather the coalition leadership that's still free. Prepare defensive positions. If I'm not back in 72 hours, assume I'm dead and proceed with whatever strategy gives you the best chance of survival. Don't waste time on rescue missions or revenge. Just protect what we built and make sure my death means something. Ronan grabbed her arm, forcing her to face him. Allara, you don't have to do this alone. Yes, I do. Because I've spent 12 years watching competent people get destroyed by kings who feared them. I've watched loyalty get rewarded with exile. I've watched strategic genius get called treason because it made inadequate rulers look small. I'm done watching. I'm done accepting that the frontier belongs to whoever inherits the biggest crown. She pulled free. It's time someone proved that competence can defeat authority, that strategy can overcome brutality, that a woman thrown away like garbage can dismantle the empire that tried to bury her. When? Tonight. Before Kael moves the coalition prisoners to secure locations. Before Seraphine finalizes whatever endgame she's been building toward. Before the formal charges go through and executions become inevitable. Ronan looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her into an embrace that felt like goodbye, and promise compressed into the same gesture. Come back alive. We still have an empire to build. I'll try. Don't try. Succeed. Because I'm getting tired of watching capable people sacrifice themselves to prove points that dead people can't defend. She stepped back, meeting his eyes one last time. If I don't come back, make sure the coalition remembers why we built this. Not for power, not for territory, but because the frontier deserved better than endless violence and kings who confused authority with competence. Then she turned and walked into the darkness. Alone. Armed with nothing but Ronan's grandfather's blade and 12 years of knowledge about how empires functioned, heading back into the territory that had exiled her, to break into the command center that had once been hers, to steal evidence that would either save the coalition or confirm she'd been right all along about the cost of challenging power. The moon hung low and red above the frontier like a wound that refused to heal, and somewhere in Iron Hollow's command center, Seraphine sat beside Kael planning executions, while Marcus's daughter cried herself to sleep in a locked room and 73 coalition representatives waited to discover if loyalty to competence was rewarded with survival or just a different kind of death. The war Allara had spent 6 months trying to prevent was about to begin. Not with armies, not with violence, but with one woman walking back into the empire that had tried to destroy her, carrying nothing but knowledge and rage and the desperate certainty that some things were worth dying for. Whether anyone would survive to remember that sacrifice was a question only the next 72 hours would answer. Iron Hollow's command center looked different at 3 in the morning. Empty corridors that had once buzzed with administrative chaos. Dark offices that smelled like old paper and the ghosts of 1,000 strategic decisions. Security systems Allara had helped design 12 years ago, now the only thing standing between her and the evidence that would either save the coalition or confirm she'd gambled everything on a strategy too ambitious to succeed. She moved through the shadows like smoke, using maintenance corridors and service access points that most wolves had forgotten existed. The building's architecture was burned into her memory the way some people remembered childhood homes. Every hallway, every locked door, every camera blind spot. She'd built this place as much as she'd built the empire it housed. Now she was going to use that knowledge to tear it all down. The secure archives were located 3 floors below ground level, protected by biometric scanners and encryption protocols that should have been impossible to bypass. Should have been. Except Allara had written the security specifications herself, and she'd included a maintenance override hidden so deep in the system code that even Kael's current security chief probably didn't know it existed. Insurance, she'd called it back then. A way to access critical systems if the primary administrators were compromised or killed. Now it was the skeleton key to an empire's darkest secrets. The biometric scanner hummed as Allara pressed her palm against the glass. The system should have rejected her immediately. Her clearance had been revoked the moment Kael exiled her. But the maintenance override didn't care about clearance levels. It only cared about biometric matches from the original system architects. The lock clicked open. Allara stepped into the archives and felt the temperature drop 15 degrees. Climate-controlled preservation for documents too sensitive to risk deterioration. Physical records that predated Iron Hollow's digital transition. Communications marked for retention under frontier law. Everything that could destroy or validate a ruler's authority, preserved in temperature-controlled darkness. She moved to the communications archive and started searching. Not randomly, systematically. Looking for correspondence between Seraphine and neutral pack leaders. Between Seraphine and mercenary contacts. Between Seraphine and anyone who might have helped orchestrate the systematic destruction of the Coalition. 2 hours of searching produced nothing. The records were either perfectly clean or someone had already purged anything incriminating. Allara sat back, forcing herself to think through the variables. Seraphine was too smart to leave obvious evidence lying around, but she was also too ambitious to operate without documentation. Ambitious people kept records, insurance against allies who might turn on them, leverage against enemies who might discover their schemes. The question was where someone like Seraphine would hide documentation she needed but couldn't risk anyone finding. Then Allara remembered something, a conversation she'd overheard 6 months ago, the night before Kael exiled her. Seraphine and Kael beneath the cedar grove, voices drifting through moonlight. She'll never leave you. She's too loyal. That conversation hadn't been recorded in official channels because it happened outside the compound, but Seraphine had been wearing her personal communication device, the expensive one she used for private calls and secure messaging. And Iron Hollow's network architecture required all personal devices used within compound boundaries to back up to central servers. Security protocol, designed to prevent intelligence leaks, a protocol Allara had implemented herself. She accessed the backup servers and started searching through Seraphine's device history. Months of communications, thousands of messages, most of them innocuous. Then she found it. A message thread between Seraphine and Alpha Crow, one of Kael's military allies, dated 3 weeks before the assault on Moongrave. The attack succeeds when we convince Kael it's about restoring authority, but the real victory comes after, when coalition leadership is executed and their territories are vulnerable. That's when we move. Restructure the entire frontier under new governance, with Kael as the ceremonial head and us controlling actual policy. Alara's blood went cold, because that message confirmed what she'd suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. Seraphine wasn't just manipulating Kael into destroying the coalition. She was building a shadow government designed to replace Iron Hollow's traditional authority with something far more dangerous. A system where kings stayed on their thrones, but real power belonged to the people whispering in their ears. Allara kept searching and found more. Messages to mercenary contacts about border raids designed to destabilize coalition territories. Communications with neutral pack leaders offering them favorable terms if they supported formal charges against Moongrave's leadership. Detailed plans for restructuring frontier governance once the coalition was destroyed. Every piece of evidence she needed to prove Seraphine had orchestrated this entire conflict. She started copying files to a portable drive, working fast because every second she stayed in the archives increased the chance of discovery. That's when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Multiple sets, moving with the purposeful rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were going. Allara killed the console lights and pressed herself into the shadows between filing cabinets. The archive door opened. Seraphine entered first, elegant even at 3 in the morning, followed by 2 enforcers who looked like they'd been carved from granite. She walked directly to the communications section and started searching through records with the casual familiarity of someone who'd done this before, looking for the same evidence Allara had just copied, probably planning to destroy it now that the coalition was nearly broken and the endgame was approaching. Allara stayed perfectly still, controlling her breathing, watching Seraphine work with the cold efficiency of someone who'd built an empire in the shadows while everyone looked at the king. That's when Seraphine spoke without turning around. "You can come out, Allara. I know you're here." Can smell the desperation and self-righteousness from across the room. The enforcers moved to flank the filing cabinets, cutting off escape routes. Allara stepped into the light, one hand resting on Ronan's grandfather's blade. The two women stared at each other across 10 feet of climate-controlled darkness. Seraphine smiled, sharp and satisfied. I wondered if you'd figure it out, if you were actually as competent as everyone claimed, or just lucky enough to look smart compared to Kael's incompetence. Allara's voice came out flat. You played him perfectly, fed his insecurity, validated his ego, convinced him that destroying me was the only way to prove his authority, all while building your own power structure in the shadows. Seraphine's smile widened. You say that like it's complicated. Men like Kael are easy. They want two things, to feel powerful and to be told they're special. Give them that and they'll destroy anyone who threatens the fantasy, even women who built their entire empire for them. So this was always about replacing him, not replacing. Controlling. There's a difference. Kael gets to keep his crown and his ceremonies and his throne. He just doesn't get to make actual decisions anymore. Those belong to people smart enough to see past performance theater to how power actually functions. People like you, people like us. You and I aren't so different, Allara. We both recognized that Kael was a hollow crown. We both built real power while he played king. The only difference is I was smart enough to stay in the shadows instead of standing beside him where everyone could see I was the architect. We're nothing alike, aren't we? You spent 12 years manipulating Kael into making decisions you wanted, feeding him strategies disguised as advice, building systems he'd claim credit for while you did the actual work. That's not service, darling. That's puppet mastery with better branding. The words hit harder than Allara wanted to admit, because there was truth buried in the accusation. She had manipulated Kael, had used his need for validation to push strategies he never would have chosen independently, had built an empire in his name while making sure everyone knew it only functioned because of her competence. The difference was intent. Allara had done it to protect the pack, to prevent wars, to keep families alive through winters that would have killed them under less competent leadership. Seraphine had done it for power. But from the outside, the methods looked identical. Allara's grip tightened on the blade. The difference between us is I cared about the people I was protecting. You only care about control. And you think that makes you noble? Caring doesn't change the outcome. You still manipulated him, still built systems designed to make him dependent on you, still made sure he'd fall apart the moment you left. The only reason you're angry is because I did it better than you did. You destroyed the coalition, orchestrated attacks that killed innocent wolves, used children as hostages to force cooperation. I restructured the frontier to remove inefficient leadership and consolidate power under competent governance. The violence was necessary. The hostages were leverage. All of it was strategy you would have implemented yourself if you'd been willing to make hard choices. Allara felt rage building in her chest like pressure behind a dam. Because Seraphine was wrong about everything except the one thing that mattered. They both understood how power actually worked. The question was what they chose to do with that understanding. I'm leaving with this evidence. It proves you orchestrated this entire conflict, proves you manipulated Kael into starting a war designed to consolidate your power. Every territorial alpha on the frontier is going to see exactly what you've been building. Seraphine's expression didn't change. You think that matters? Think exposing me changes anything? Kael needs to believe I love him more than he needs to admit I've been controlling him. The coalition alphas would rather negotiate with me than fight a war they'll lose. Even if you expose everything, I'll negotiate immunity in exchange for preventing further violence. Because that's how power works. People forgive almost anything if the alternative is worse. Then I'll make sure the alternative isn't worse. How? By killing me? That makes you a murderer and proves I was right about you choosing violence when strategy fails. By exposing me? I'll spin it as partnership instead of manipulation. Kael and I working together to eliminate threats to frontier stability. The narrative belongs to whoever controls it, Allara. You taught me that yourself. I never taught you to use children as weapons. No. I learned that from watching the frontier devour people like your Marcus. Good men forced to betray their principles because the alternative was losing what they loved. You want to know the real difference between us? I'm willing to use that reality. You're still pretending it can be fixed. It can be fixed. By building systems where good people don't have to choose between their children and their principles. And how's that working out? Your coalition is days from execution. Your allies are imprisoned. Your evidence only matters if you survive long enough to present it, which you won't. She gestured to the enforcers. Kill her. Make it look like she was caught breaking into secure facilities. Tragic ending for a traitor who couldn't accept exile gracefully. The enforcers moved forward. Allara pulled Ronan's blade and felt the weight of it settle into her palm like it had been forged specifically for this moment. The fight was brutal and fast. First enforcer came high. Allara went low, blade finding the gap between ribs with surgical precision. He dropped hard, blood spreading across climate-controlled floors that had never been designed for violence. Second enforcer was smarter, circled, waited for an opening. Found one when Allara's injured ribs screamed and her movement stuttered for half a second. His fist connected with her jaw hard enough to crack teeth. Allara tasted copper and fury. Drove her blade up through his stomach with enough force that the tip punched through his spine. He fell without making a sound. Allara turned to face Seraphine, breathing hard, blood running from her split lip. The two women stared at each other across bodies and evidence and 12 years of accumulated choices. Seraphine's expression had shifted from satisfaction to something colder. Calculation. You're going to kill me. Allara wanted it with an intensity that felt like madness, but killing Seraphine proved every accusation she'd leveled about violence replacing strategy. And Allara had spent 6 months building something better than that. No, I'm going to expose you, show every territorial alpha exactly what you've been building. Then I'm going to let the frontier decide what justice looks like for people who manipulate kings into murdering competent advisors. You'll never make it out of this compound alive. Watch me. Allara grabbed the portable drive and ran. Out of the archives, through maintenance corridors, past security checkpoints that were starting to wake up as alarms screamed through the building. She made it to the eastern wall before they caught up to her. 20 wolves, armed, positioned between her and freedom. At the center stood Kael. He looked terrible, exhausted, hollowed out by choices that had seemed justified at the time but felt increasingly like mistakes that couldn't be undone. Behind him stood Seraphine, blood on her silver dress, her expression transforming from cold calculation to desperate performance. She attacked me, killed my guards. She's completely unhinged. Kael looked between them, trying to parse truth from theater. Allara raised the portable drive. This contains every communication Seraphine's had over the past 6 months. Messages to mercenary contacts about border raids, conversations with neutral alphas about restructuring frontier governance, plans for controlling you while letting you keep your crown. Everything you need to understand who's actually been orchestrating this war. Lies. She's fabricating evidence to save herself. Then let's review it together. Right now. In front of witnesses. If I'm lying, execute me. If I'm telling the truth, the frontier deserves to know who's been manipulating its leadership. Kael was silent for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Give me the drive. Allara looked at him. At the man she'd loved and served and built an empire for. At the king who'd thrown her away because his pride couldn't handle her competence. And she realized something that felt like grief and liberation compressed into the same emotion. She didn't want his vindication. Didn't need him to admit he'd been wrong. Didn't care if he ever understood what he'd lost when he'd chosen ego over survival. She just wanted him to stop destroying people because facing his own inadequacy was too painful. Allara threw the drive at his feet. Review it. Don't review it. Believe me. Believe her. I don't care anymore, Kael. I spent 12 years trying to make you see what you were capable of becoming, trying to build you into the king you pretended to be. And all it did was teach me that some people would rather burn their empire to the ground than admit they needed help building it. She stepped toward the wall, toward Guamtsin. I'm leaving. You can shoot me in the back and prove Seraphine right about everything. Or you can let me go and finally acknowledge that competence was never the threat. Your fear of it was. Kael raised his hand. For a terrible moment, Allara thought he was signaling the guards to fire. Instead, he lowered it slowly. Go. Just that. One word. Carrying 12 years of regret and recognition compressed into 2 letters. Allara climbed the wall and dropped into the wilderness beyond without looking back. Behind her, she heard Kael's voice giving orders. Seal the compound. Wake the council. We're reviewing this evidence immediately. Then Seraphine's voice, sharp with panic. You're going to believe a traitor over me after everything we've built together? Kael's response was quiet, but absolutely final. We didn't build anything. You manipulated me into destroying the only person who actually knew how to run this pack. Now I'm going to find out if you're a partner or just another person who saw me as a useful crown to hide behind. Allara ran until Iron Hollow was nothing but torchlight behind her, and the frontier stretched endless and dark ahead. She collapsed against a tree 3 miles from the border, ribs screaming, lungs burning, every muscle in her body demanding rest she couldn't afford, but alive. Free. Carrying nothing but the knowledge that she'd survived and the hope that evidence she'd left behind would be enough to save the coalition. Dawn broke gray and cold across the eastern territories. Allara reached Moongrave's borders just as early patrols were starting their rounds. Ronan met her at the gates, took one look at her blood-covered face and torn clothes, and pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home to something she'd never had before. "Did you get it?" "I got it." Left it with Kael, along with 2 dead enforcers and Seraphine's entire strategy exposed. What happens next is up to him, and if he chooses wrong, then we fight. But at least we fight knowing we tried every option that didn't require thousands of deaths first. Ronan studied her carefully. "You look different. I feel different. Like something that was holding me together for 12 years finally broke, and I'm still standing anyway. That's called freedom." "Is it?" "Feels more like exhaustion mixed with terror that this might not work." Welcome to leadership. It's mostly that, with occasional moments of thinking you might actually know what you're doing. Despite everything, Allara smiled. The coalition representatives who'd escaped Iron Hollow's dragnet were waiting in Moongrave's main hall. Helena Ravencroft, Thomas Redclaw, 16 other territorial alphas who'd risked everything to build something better than endless violence. They watched Allara enter with expressions that held hope and fear compressed into the same exhausted faces. Helena spoke first. "Well, I exposed Seraphine's manipulation, provided evidence of her orchestrating the conflict, left Kael with a choice between admitting he was played or doubling down on the lie. And the wolves still imprisoned in Iron Hollow? That depends on what Kael decides. If he accepts the evidence, he'll have to release them or admit he knew about Seraphine's schemes. If he refuses to believe it, then we prepare for war." The room was silent. Then Thomas stood. "I've known Kael Drathan for 30 years. Watched him inherit an empire he didn't earn and spend decades terrified of losing it. That fear made him easy to manipulate. But underneath it, there's still a man who cares about his pack, who wants to be the king his father was. If you gave him evidence of Seraphine's betrayal, he'll act on it. Because pride is powerful, but survival is stronger." The next 48 hours felt like waiting for a verdict on whether the frontier could evolve past its worst instincts or would slide back into familiar brutality. Reports filtered in slowly. Kael had reviewed the evidence publicly in front of Iron Hollow's council. Seraphine had been arrested and detained pending investigation. Coalition prisoners were being released to neutral territory under ceasefire terms. The formal execution charges had been dropped. Not because Kael admitted he was wrong, but because the evidence made defending Seraphine impossible without destroying what remained of his authority. On the 3rd day, a messenger arrived at Moongrave carrying official correspondence sealed with Iron Hollow's crest. Ronan opened it and read aloud, "To the leadership of the Eastern Coalition. After thorough review of evidence regarding recent frontier conflicts, Iron Hollow acknowledges that certain advisors acted beyond their authority and against the interests of peaceful governance. All charges against coalition leadership are hereby rescinded. Iron Hollow proposes a formal summit to discuss terms for lasting peace and economic cooperation. Signed, Alpha Kael Drathan." The hall erupted in cautious celebration. Not triumph, not vindication, just the exhausted relief of people who'd survived something that should have killed them. Allara stood apart from the celebration, staring at the letter. He didn't apologize. Ronan moved to stand beside her. "Did you expect him to?" "No. Kings don't apologize. They just change the subject and pretend the past never happened." "Is that enough for you?" "It has to be, because the alternative is letting perfect be the enemy of good. We didn't win everything, but we won survival. We won the right to keep building. We won proof that competence can challenge authority without requiring total destruction. And Seraphine will be tried under frontier law. probably executed for conspiracy and manipulation of territorial leadership. Her death won't fix anything, but at least it removes one person who confused power with control. Ronan was quiet for a moment. What happens now? Now we build. Formalize the coalition. Create economic systems that don't require constant warfare to maintain. Prove to the frontier that cooperation works better than domination. Show the next generation that competent people don't have to choose between exile and submission. That's a long-term strategy. I'm good at those. The summit happened 3 weeks later in neutral territory. Delegates from 47 packs, the largest gathering of territorial leadership in frontier history. Kael attended representing Iron Hollow, looking older and harder than Allara remembered. They didn't speak directly for the first 2 days, just circled each other in negotiations like wolves remembering old pack dynamics that no longer applied. On the third day, Kael found her alone on the cliffs overlooking the neutral grounds. He stood 10 feet away, maintaining the distance of people who'd once been intimate and now were strangers. I read your economic proposals for coalition integration. And? They're brilliant. Better than anything my current advisors could produce. Better than anything I could produce myself. Allara said nothing, just waited. Kael continued, his voice carrying weight he'd never possessed before. I spent 12 years believing my crown meant I deserved authority. That inheriting power was the same as earning it. That anyone who made me look small was a threat instead of an asset. He paused. You were right about everything. I was a frightened king clinging to authority I never earned, destroying the only person who knew how to make that authority mean something. And it cost me an empire. Cost me you. Cost me any claim to being the ruler my father wanted me to become. Allara met his eyes. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to hear it. Because spending the past 3 weeks reviewing your coalition framework showed me what real leadership looks like. And because I can't fix what I did to you, but I can at least acknowledge it. Acknowledgement doesn't resurrect the dead, doesn't undo exile, doesn't erase 12 years of manipulation and 6 months of war. I know. But it's all I have to offer. That, and a promise that Iron Hollow will honor coalition agreements, will support economic integration, will stop treating competent people as threats to be eliminated. Allara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised both of them. Thank you. Kael looked startled. For what? For teaching me that loyalty to incompetent authority is just another form of self-destruction. For showing me that some empires deserve to fall because they're built on fear instead of respect. For being exactly the kind of king I needed you to be so I could become the kind of leader I was always capable of becoming. She stepped toward the edge of the cliff. You wanted to know if your acknowledgement matters. It does. Not because it changes the past, but because it proves people can evolve past their worst instincts if they're willing to face what those instincts cost them. Is there anything I can do to make amends? Lead better. Build something worth protecting instead of just defending inherited authority. Show the next generation that kings can admit mistakes without losing their crowns. And us? There is no us. There's a woman who survived being thrown away and a man who's learning to rule without destroying everyone smarter than him. That's not a relationship. That's just two people who finally understand what power actually requires. Kael nodded slowly. Then he did something Allara never expected. He bowed. Not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that competence deserved respect even when it came from someone he'd exiled. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Allara alone on the cliffs with the wind and the knowledge that some victories felt more like grief than triumph. The coalition was formalized 6 months later, 23 territories signing economic integration agreements based on frameworks Allara had designed, trade routes optimized for efficiency instead of political favoritism, dispute resolution systems that didn't require violence, leadership councils that valued competence over bloodlines. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And better was enough to build on. Allara stood in Moongrave's reconstructed council chamber watching territorial representatives negotiate resource allocation with the kind of strategic precision that would have been impossible 2 years earlier. Ronan moved to stand beside her. We did it. We survived. There's a difference. Stop being modest. We built something that actually works, something that doesn't require constant warfare to maintain. That's revolutionary. It's fragile, One ambitious alpha with enough charisma could fracture the whole thing. Then we make sure the systems are strong enough to survive ambitious alphas. That's what good architecture does. It functions regardless of who's using it. Allara smiled. When did you become an optimist? Around the time I watched a woman walk into hostile territory alone, carrying nothing but intelligence and rage, and somehow dismantle an empire without starting a war. That kind of competence makes you believe impossible things might actually work. She looked at him. What happens to us now? We keep building, keep proving that cooperation works better than domination. Keep showing the frontier that women thrown away for being too competent can create empires that don't devour their own. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. And the answer is we figure it out the same way we figured everything else out. One strategic decision at a time, without sacred bonds or forced commitments. Just two people choosing to build something together because the alternative is building alone. Allara considered that. Then she kissed him. Not desperately, not dramatically, just once. A promise that some things were worth building even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Years passed. The coalition expanded to 37 territories. Then 42. Then 53. Border wars decreased by 73%. Economic prosperity increased across all member territories. A new generation of wolves grew up learning that competence mattered more than bloodlines. Iron Hollow integrated into the coalition framework after Kael stepped down and leadership transitioned to a council system. He lived out his remaining years quietly, teaching young alphas about the cost of inherited authority and the importance of surrounding themselves with people smarter than them. Seraphine was executed for conspiracy and manipulation. Her death was swift and unremarkable. History remembered her only as a cautionary tale about confusing manipulation with strategy. Marcus's daughter was returned safely and grew up to become a coalition negotiator specializing in hostage recovery. She wrote her father's story as a thesis on the ethics of impossible choices and dedicated it to the woman who'd saved her life without knowing her name. And Allara Veyne became the first High Architect of the Eastern Coalition. Not through inheritance, not through violence, through competence recognized and respected by people who'd learned that real power came from building systems stronger than individual ambition. She stood on Moongrave's walls 20 years after walking away from Iron Hollow and looked across territories that had once been battlefield and were now connected by trade routes and economic cooperation and the radical idea that survival didn't require endless domination. Ronan found her there, gray-haired now, but still carrying himself like controlled violence waiting for purpose. You're thinking about him. She didn't need to ask who, sometimes, wondering if he ever understood what he lost. If he died knowing he'd been a hollow crown, or if he convinced himself the narrative he'd built was real. Does it matter? No. But I'm still human enough to wonder. That's good. Means you haven't let this job turn you into something cold. The frontier needs leaders who remember being broken by people they loved. Makes us careful about who we trust and ruthless about protecting what we build. Allara leaned into him, feeling the weight of 2 decades compressed into comfortable silence. Do you ever regret it? Taking me in when every rational calculation said I was too dangerous to trust? Every single day. Then I remember what we built and decide dangerous people willing to burn down broken systems are exactly what dying empires need. We didn't just burn it down, we built something better. You built something better. I just gave you the space to do it. We built it together. There's a difference. The sun set across the eastern territories, painting the sky colors that looked like hope mixed with memory. And in the distance, wolves moved between territories without fear. Children played without learning the language of endless war. Trade caravans traveled routes protected by cooperation instead of conquest. The architecture of a new world, built by people the old world had tried to destroy. Proven sustainable by generations who grew up believing competence mattered more than crowns. Allara Veyne had spent 12 years building an empire for a man who'd thrown her away for being indispensable. Then she'd spent 20 years building something far more dangerous, an empire that didn't need kings, just people willing to work together because the alternative was survival through endless brutality. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real was what the frontier had needed all along, not rulers who demanded submission. Leaders who earned respect by building systems that actually worked. The story ended the way all good stories end. Not with conquest, not with revenge, but with transformation, and the quiet understanding that some victories aren't measured in crowns captured or enemies destroyed. They're measured in children who grow up free, in territories that prosper through cooperation, in the slow, grinding work of proving that competence can defeat authority when given enough time and strategic precision. Allara had been called traitor by a king too frightened to acknowledge her value. History would remember her as the architect who rebuilt the frontier from ashes and proved that empires built by capable people outlast kingdoms built on fear. That was legacy enough. For a woman who'd started kneeling in frozen dirt and ended standing on walls overlooking an entirely new world. The outcast became the legend. The exiled became the architect. And the woman once thrown away for being too competent became the foundation upon which an entire civilization learned to build something better than endless war. The frontier belonged to whoever was willing to fight for it. Allara had fought with strategy instead of violence, with competence instead of cruelty, with the patient certainty that good architecture outlasts ambitious rulers. And in the end, that made all the difference.